Hello guys, and welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be doing part 2 of my World Championship bracket prediction, now with deck lists published. So, between every set I will be going through and looking at all 8 deck lists from each pairing, and talking about the strengths and the weaknesses of the decks themselves the first time through, and then briefly going over how I think they will be matched up against each other, with those decks specifically, as well as just how well I think the decks are built, or how comfortable I think the players will be on the decks, and that is going to inform, hopefully, a different outcome of my bracket prediction. But even if you don't care about the bracket prediction part of this part, I will be, quote-unquote, reviewing every single one of these decks. Now, I haven't played every one of these decks, but an eye test is usually good enough. So, this is my previous bracket right here. As you can see, I had Killswitch taking it over Spoker 3-2 in the finals. Will this be the same? Will this be different? We'll just have to wait and see. So let's reset the bracket, roll the intro, and get into our first pairing.
What a performance there by J-King.
J-King, full plot armor.
J-King is pushing himself into the ranks of the legend.
J-King is our world champion! J-King 7! What? The back-to-back Cards world champion!
Alrighty, so our first matchup here is, once again, TreePipit versus Spoker. Now, I'm not going to go through who all of these players are again, unless it's particularly relevant. If you want to hear my thoughts on the players themselves and a bit on their experience, playstyle, etc., you can go back and watch the previous video. Both of these videos are going to have some value. But now we're here to talk about their decks. So let's start with TreePipit. Again, the format is a best of 5. Each player brings 4 decks. One gets banned. They have to win with the other 3. So TreePipit, his first deck here is a Britain USA deck, and the best I can describe this as is a sort of combo control deck. So what is the combo aspect of it? Well, there is 2 Kangaroo Transport, which is a new Blood and Iron card that gives a British infantry blitz, and it counts as a tank, meaning you can give it blitz and then it can move and attack on the same turn. And then it is running 2 Gurkha Rifles, which is a Fury. No, actually, Gurkha Rifles does not have Fury. That's just simply a guide. But there is 4 Frontier Forces, which is a 2/5 Fury Infantry. And then there is a Black Watch, which is a 2/6 Fury Infantry. And then you might be wondering, well, how are what are you using for the burst part? Well, that, I imagine, will be the Royal Research. Now, it's not an OTK deck, to be clear. This is merely just a combo in an otherwise control deck. There's the production order in here, there's 2 Thunderbolts. This deck seems like it's just intended to be good into air, with a lot of fighters, the Spitfire in here as well, the Kitty Hawk, as well as have a win condition beyond just play big stuff. So if it's against like a combo deck, or if it's against a slower control deck, it can threaten to burst a ton of damage out of nowhere to close out games. And in theory, I think that type of deck is very good. Now, where I'm very sus about this particular deck is there's only 2 War Machine, despite only 9 US slots, so we're missing some War Machines here. There's certainly enough card draw in this deck with 2 Crusaders and 4 Convoys, which makes me think, is this intended to be more of a, OTK deck? But I feel like you can't consistently OTK with this deck. There's also not a lot of cheap British orders to combo with the Crusader. There's Monty, but you're generally playing Monty whenever you can, and then there's 2 Kangaroo Transports, and one of them is presumably being saved if you're cycling through your entire deck. So there's definitely some questionable things in there, and then it seems a little top-heavy for a deck that only runs 2 War Machines. And if you look at actually what the guard units are in this deck, there's the 1 Black Watch, but there's no Glamour Boys. And then there's 1 First Responders, and Frontier Force summons the Garrison unit, which technically has guard, and the Gurkha Rifles have guard. But I just feel like you're not really doing anything between turns, like maybe you do something on turn 2. That's not even a guarantee. There's a large number of games you will not be doing anything on turn 2. And then you're not really doing much, you maybe Frontier Force on 3, but that's not a great 3-drop. That's not really soaking in a ton of aggression from your opponent if they've just had a good start. And, if they're Jaguar, there's supply priorities, but there's 1 supply priorities. So, this deck just has a lot of 1-ofs. I feel like its curve is kind of questionable. I'm not sure why there's a single 70th Brigade in here. Can it win games? Absolutely. You can definitely win games. You can play War Machine on 2 into, like, Sincerely Yours into, like, Thunderbolt against a slow hand, and then you get an early card for bombing, and, like, you're off to the races, and this deck works perfectly fine. This deck is definitely not a deck that is, like, I'm expecting to lose 3 games in a row. However, it is definitely a lot weaker than I think you could build a deck with these 2 nation combinations. Then Tree's second deck is a USA-Poland deck with only 6 Polish cards. And if we take a look at the deck, it has some very interesting things going on in it. So there's some aspects of just the classic frontline package with 164th Scout Card Greyhound, 2 Bocage Warfare, so definitely very interested in getting a strong start and taking the front line. And then there's an Enemy Spotted, which seems somewhat counterintuitive. And then there's a Pontoon Bridge, which has no synergy with any of the cards we've really seen before. This 7 TP, this is just an insane Polish card. The Zamosk Uprising, I probably butchered that. Apologies to Polish speakers. Also, just a really good card. M10's Pathfinder's Hellcat, the Calliope. Just a solid card. Both of our players here seem to rate this card very highly. Research. The Research strikes me as a little off guard because there's no ramp in this deck other than the US Research. So it seems difficult to get to nukes, but I suppose it's just like if the game goes late, because you don't have Blitzkrieg, you can't close out games quickly. 4 Sherman, which again makes the Enemy Spotted quite odd to me, because 4 Sherman is usually enough to draw out. 2 Firebombs, We Can Do It, and 2 Thunderbolts, 2 First Grenadier Regiments, and a P-51B. So it sort of gets a little heavy at the end. We also see some similarities to the other deck with the Firebombs and the Thunderbolts. These are cards that the Tree is clearly rated very highly. So it seems like this might be somewhat targeted against air. And Bocage Warfare, definitely really good against air in combination with one of these 1-3 tanks. The Uprising card, very good against air. And obviously Thunderbolt, P-51B, very targeted against air. But he's not running strategic bombing in the deck. Which then sort of brings me back to, like, well, why are you running, like, US Research and not strategic bombing? There's just some very big question marks to me in the deck building decision making. Also, I'm not super convinced that Poland was worth the 6 slots with 7 TP, Uprising, and First Grenadier Regiment. Now, are these 6 very powerful cards? Yes. But would this not have just been better with German Ally for 35T Blitzkrieg? Or with Soviet Ally for the 12th Guards Mechanized? Because you're already running 2 Hellcat, 4 Sherman, 3 M10. Maybe. But that is the deck. Now we have a Germany-Italy 4 attack deck. And on the top end, there's just sort of the 4 attack stuff you would expect. Leopold, FW, 7th LPD, the Machis. Then there's some stuff that you might not expect, with Naval Engagement and La Decima. Don't really have synergy with the deck beyond just being board clears, but, you know, fair enough. Board clears are good. Panther D is somewhat surprising to me, but I suppose there's not a lot of hard removal going around in a lot of decks, so if you can just get a Panther D down against, like, one of these Soviet Ally tank decks, they probably can't kill it, and then it's going to kill them very quickly. And then you have 3 Schützen. I'm kind of shocked there's only 3 of these. You have 3 of the Italian 4 attack guy, the 49th Infantry. Again, kind of surprised there's only 3 of these. And then if you look at the early game, well, we have 3 dive bombing, which, I mean, I kind of get the synergy of dive bombing with, like, Schützen. If you reduce the unit's attack to 0, you can then fight it for free, as in you don't take any return damage. 3 of them is a little surprising, because if we take a look at card draw, well, what in here can draw cards? We have Spring Offensive, only 2. So 2 Spring Offensive is 4 draw, 2 Erados is 6 draw, and then 2 FWs is 8 draw. I feel like 8 draw is not enough that we want to be running 3 dive bombing 2 7 strike. Africa Corps is also just a bizarre one that you would run this rather than running one of the many German elites you don't already run in the deck. But I suppose it can give you, like, second Leopold, and it does have some flexibility. And then there's just some really solid cards, like Attack of the Colonies, Hipper, obviously. Double Crossfire. I have not had too much success with Crossfire, but maybe there's a particular matchup that that Killswitch is intending to target with this deck. But all around, I think this deck is missing some cards that I think would be fairly obvious, like, for example, the Panzer 4H rather than the Panther D. And then, on the other hand, this deck is just somewhat oddly built, in my opinion. Like, the 3 off-Klorong, yes, it's something early you can play, and it scales later in the game. Maybe off-Klorong is not the card to target here, but I don't know, just the 3 dive bombing. Also, 3 dive bombing makes the spring offensive much worse, because if you take a look at this, the deck is 16 orders, and, well, 15 once you play a spring offensive. And spring offensive, you want to be drawing double units with 4 more attacks. So that's 16 orders, plus a bunch of units that don't have 4 attack. Spring offensives are basically just going to be more expensive Convoy. Maybe they average out to beat about Convoy. But yeah, I feel like there's, again, some very meaningful issues with this deck. Then we have a patented Japan-Germany air deck. Tree has brought this to the last OCC. He brought it to Quals, and now he's brought an edited version here to top 16. And yeah, it's basically running a lot of the same stuff as before. The suppressions, the air superiorities to get advantage of running air units. And then, of course, he's running some Heians, some FWs, the Dragon Slayers, the Restorers, the stuff you would expect. Now he's got the new Aichi, the new Key 30 Ann. Now, we've seen this deck obviously find success. And this deck is capable of doing really well, because this deck is capable of just having really powerful starts. Like, you can do, like, a Rado Air Superiority on turn 2, clear board on turn 2, turn 3 you play an Audacity, and then, like, turn 4, I don't know, you play a Zerstory, you play an Aichi, you do anything on curve, and then you eventually, like, curve into just hitting them down with big fighters. And that can happen. The issue is, if you take a look at this curve, there's 12 cards to play before turn 3, and there is only 2 AoEs in the deck. There's 1 Death Ravishers and 1 Bonsai. So, like, this deck can very easily just sort of get blown off the board, because also a lot of your cards are just 1 in, 1 out. Like single target removal, like Air Superiority. The Command Failure is a somewhat odd choice for me here. So, yeah, I just feel like this deck is just playing big, good units, and playing big, good units can win you the game sometimes, but it's not as consistent as other decks. So, again, I think this is not as weak as perhaps the German deck. I think it's a little bit more consistent with its pieces, but again, just a slower, questionable deck. Now let's take a look at Spoker's decks. Spoker's first deck up here is Japan-Germany Aggro. Very different Japan-Germany. But we have immediately out of the gates, I hate this deck. Why do I hate this deck? Because this deck is only running 3 expansion. If you're running 3 expansion in a Jaggro deck that's not also running, like, Enigmas and Take Liberties, which this deck is not, you're building Jaggro wrong. It's very simple. Put in 4 expansion unless you are consistently decking yourself with the other draw currently in the deck. Now, what else is added to this deck? Well, we have 1 copy of the 58th Infantry. That's fine. With testing with this card, I don't think it needs to be a 4 of, in the same way Shibata was. You just can have better things to put in Jaggro with the new Aichi. However, if we look at this deck, what other Blooded Iron cards are in this deck? Well, it's 2 Aunt Fredas. And this is a very interesting card, because obviously you're going to have no shortage of infantry to play the first stage on. When it comes to tanks, you have the 35Ts. He's put in 1 WinnerWillWin. You have the Type 94s, and of course the Type 93s, although those are a little weaker. But you can usually fairly consistently get through the part 2 of Aunt Freda, but the third part has to go on a fighter, and this deck only runs 3 fighters, and the 4 fighters, sorry, it actually runs Seiyun. And of the 4 fighters, 3 of them are, like, kind of need to be removed instantly anyways, and, like, you're probably not gonna be playing it on curve. Like, you're probably not doing, like, infantry on 1, Aunt Freda on 2, and a tank, buff it on 3, Zerstorer on 4, Aunt Freda buff on Zerstorer on 5. That's probably not happening. So, yeah, it's coming out later in the game. Like, your hand size is somewhat small, because, again, only 1 20-second infantry. This deck just doesn't have the card draw to be justified in this. And Aunt Freda, it's a little weird, because Aunt Freda is definitely a card that can be made up. It can kind of make up for card draw in a way, just because it has so many different steps. It does so much in a single card. You get so much value out of a single card that you don't need other cards in your hand. But the issue is you need 3 different types of units, and your deck doesn't run a large amount of all 3 of those types of units. So you need to be able to draw into those units as well as the Intradiction. So yeah, I think that to me, this is a pretty questionable build of Jagro. However, it's a deck with Cavalry Regiment, 35T Signal Regiment, Type 93. This deck can win against anything on, like, turn 4, regardless of how many expansions it has, regardless of how many fighters it has for the Intradiction. It's Jagro. Jagro is just a very solid deck. Now, how does Jagro match up into what Tree brought? There's a bunch of crossfires. However, I do think Jagro is probably just a pretty solid deck. Then we have our first Soviet Germany tank deck. This is a deck that I expect to see a lot of as we go through the decks lists of our 16 players here. And let's start over here on the top end. We have KV1 and Corson. This makes sense. Pack 40 I think is a very solid call for the meta, because there's going to be a lot of 2-cost need-to-kill units around, and a good chunk of those things are going to be tanks. Then let's look at the 4 or more attack tanks package. We have the 4 SUs, which makes sense. 2 SU-85s, the one that heals. This one, I tried it out right when I was testing out this type of deck right at the beginning of the expansion. I didn't really feel like it worked. It has 1 op, which is nice, but just 3 health is so low. Your health doesn't really matter particularly because you're an aggro deck. So the healing you get off of this is largely inconsequential. So I just found there was better things to be doing with your card slots than running a 5/3 4-cost tank. 2 SU-100s, this card, very solid. 3 SU-152s. This is quite surprising as well to me. I could see maybe one of them. Maybe even 2 of them. 3 of them, like a full stack on top of the SU-85s. This feels like you're going too far in on the heavy 4-cost tanks. I've tried a similar deck to this right when the expansion dropped, and I felt the difference. Like, I felt having all of these heavy tanks in my hand, and it did not feel good. It lost me a lot of games, and I slimmed it down to something a bit more aggressive. So I think that this is not the best way to build this deck, and I think he might struggle. However, the one benefit he has is he's running the Feldernhalle rifle. I need to ask a German how you say this. He's running this guy, which is going to give him slightly more credits off of that. This was a card that I know I considered. I saw some people testing it out. But personally, I just felt it didn't have enough synergy with the rest of the deck. It felt like you were sort of there was some incongruence with what you wanted to do in, turns 1 to 3, and then, this guy didn't really fit into your game plan all too well. It felt like there was 2 different decks. There was an aggro tank deck that doesn't want to run this card, and then there's a mid-range, bigger tank deck that wants to run more 4-attack guys, and they don't mesh together particularly well. And then, as a cost of running all of these additional cards, there's only 2 269th rifles, so you're actually running less payoff cards for your 4-attack tanks than you are running, you're cutting the synergy cards for more triggers, which I don't think you need that. You have enough already to trigger the 12th guards mechanized. And that's the important part. The one of suppression here I really like as just a way to get rid of a guard. The one of glide bombing, I've not done a lot of testing with this card, but I think it could be very, very solid. Particularly with if you're running around with a bunch of 0-op high-attack tanks. And of course, Blitzkrieg to close out a game, breakthrough, very, very solid card. So, you have very, very good elements of the deck here. I just feel like he kind of gets lost in the sauce around here. If you look at the curve, if you're an aggro deck, you don't want your curve to be half 3 drops, half 4 drops, because those are very difficult to play. You're only going to be playing one of those a turn from turns 3 to 7. And by turn 7, if your opponent's playing an aggro deck, they've probably killed you or run out of cards already. And if they're playing a control deck, they're just going to start slamming down their carbon bombers, they're going to start slamming down their bigger guards, they're going to start slamming down their bombers, and then you are going to lose because you're playing one thing at a time, and now you're playing 2 things at a time, but they're playing something that's much, much, much bigger than your things by that point in the game. So, yeah, not my favorite deck here. Now let's take a look at his US deck. It is a US-Britain ramp deck. This is sort of the deck that I think Spoker's most famous for. Compared to Tree's most famous for his Japan German air deck. Spoker absolutely loves Britain, or USA Britain ramp, and you can see a lot of the same cards that he was running before. 2 Production Order, 2 Supply Priorities, 2 for Freedom, Jasco, 4 War Machine, Albacore, US Research, America at War, 2 Engineer Regiments. So, very consistent ramp in the early game, as well as a few anti-aggro tools, with the Supply Priorities going to ensure that there's at least a chance to not get run over by aggro. And then let's start looking at what we have after that. 2 First Responders, very solid. 3 Convoys, very good draw. A lot of ramp decks don't run draw, but 3 Convoys, very good. 3 Calliopes, or Calliops, however they're pronounced. This card, very, very good at sort of taking in some of the aggression. It's going to do something the turn you play it, especially against an aggro deck where it will be more effective because they have low health units. They have lower health units in the front line that are more easily targeted, and they're going to need to remove this 2-4 artillery faster, because if it sticks around, it's just going to be picking off their guys over and over. Hellcat, I really like Hellcat in ramp, particularly in the tank meta. MI5, excellent card in ramp. And then we start getting into the bigger stuff. We have Bomber Mafia, War Bonds, 1 Raft Lightning, 3 Glamour Boys, Strap Bombing, P51B. I think this is a very good deck. I think this is by far the best deck that we've looked at so far. The one oddity is a single 60-second armored infantry, which is going to buff one of the 3, or potentially all 3 Calliopes that you have on board. Or, if you don't have any, it can give you an M4 Sherman, which can act as a little bit more card draw to trigger on like a Hellcat or a Milk Truck or something like that. So, I don't hate this card. It's just an interesting card that I don't think I would have done, but, you know, it's only a one-of, so, you know, you want to experiment, this is a safe way to experiment. And yeah, I think this is a very solid deck. All around, very, very solid deck. Definitely, not necessarily, I'm not necessarily saying that US Britain ramp is a better deck in the meta than Soviet German tanks, or than Jaggro is, because I don't think that's true. I just think the Jaggro deck and the Soviet German deck were not built as well as they could have, whereas this ramp deck was built excellently. This is an excellent ramp deck, and this sort of shows that, you know, these players aren't primarily deck builders. Like, this US Britain ramp deck is based off of an existing deck that Spoker has tested across months of ladder against months of playing scrims through multiple OCCs. This is a deck that he has tested over and over and over to get to this refined, very well-made list, whereas, you know, with like 2 weeks on the new expansion, these other decks maybe were cooking a little too hard. Now, his last deck is a Britain USA ramp, which, based on how the other decks were built, I think was a pretty safe choice. In just, you know, you're really good at playing ramp, you're really good at building ramp, just bring 2 ramp decks. So, again, we see Monty, Production Orders, Pioneers, 2 Albacores, War Machines. The fact that Albacore is stuck in the US deck when the US deck cut Cromwell, and now this Britain deck is on 1 Cromwell but still on 2 Albacores, is interesting. This is, you know, it's not bad. Like, 1 damage and pin is still very good for 2 cost, but it's just an interesting thing to note. But a ton of draw research, the 2 First Responders, the MI5s. We have even the Calliop in the Britain main. We see Ultra making a return. I like this. And then Spitfire, cheap guards, and then we get up to the 5-cost stuff. We have Sexton, M4 Firefly, War Bonds, Black Prince, the 3 Glamour Boys, Wave After Wave, Wellington, Lancaster. So a little bit heavier than the US deck, interestingly enough. However, you know, I think it is still just as good. I'd say maybe I'd favor the US deck a little bit more, just because, you know, you do have a bit more ramp and a bit less top end, whereas, you know, when you're stuck for US slots, you do have to make some cuts, and Britain does not have the best early game in the world, if you're not, like, going hard down the Brit air train. But all around, I think that is a very well-built deck. So, now, how do these decks compare to each other? Well, unfortunately for Tree, Tree's, like, this Britain deck is just, like, it's a little, I think it is not heavy enough to beat the ramp decks, while simultaneously not being good enough in the early game department to beat the aggro decks. The US Poland is definitely capable of getting a win. So is the Japan Germany. both of these decks are just sort of like, they're more mid-rangey. They're capable of getting a win if they just play on curve, but I wouldn't count on it. And then this German-Italy deck, I have some pretty huge question marks. Again, it's capable of getting a win, just because, you know, maybe you just hit Machi into a Panther D and your opponent can't answer them. But I'm much more skeptical of that. Whereas Spoker, I don't feel like... Tree, I look at his decks, I wonder how do they win. Spoker, I look at his decks, and it's like, okay, I see ways they can lose. Whereas Tree, I don't see the ways they can win, or at least I see the difficult ways for them to win. So just, I gave this to Spoker just based on, I think Spoker's just going to play more consistently. But also, a large part of me giving this to Spoker in the previous, in the previous bracket was, I just thought Tree was going to bring bad decks. I thought Spoker was going to bring not bad decks. And that factored in a lot, and we saw the decks, and to be completely honest, I think Tree brought pretty bad decks, so I will give this to Spoker 3-1. Spoker has some question marks on there, and Ramp is sometimes just hits brick hands, and Tree's decks are capable of winning. But yeah, I'm going to give that to Spoker 3-1. And if you're worried about how long this is going to be, because obviously I just spent like 20 minutes on the first set, I will be speedrunning the decks once we get past the first round, just because we'll have seen all the decks already. But now, let's jump into the next pairing of WinnerWillWin versus Intradiction. Alrighty, so the next pairing is WinnerWillWin versus Intradiction. And this is an interesting one, because now we start to see a little bit more of what I sort of expected. So the first deck here from Intradiction is a USA Soviet deck, and this is a Sherman Soviet ally tank deck. Now, personally, I don't like this with the Sherman package, but if you're going to use the Sherman package, I definitely think this is the way to do it. And I'm not that surprised that somebody brought the Sherman package to Worlds, because it is a strong, powerful package. So from Soviets, 2 sickles, of course the 4 mechanized, and the 3 269ths. Now, where the Soviet slots sort of get freed up, because those are all 9 Soviet slots in the deck, is Intradiction doesn't need to run the SUs in this deck, because with the Sherman package, he has more than enough for attack tanks. So the rest of the deck, it looks a little bit like Frontline missing a few cards, so only 2 164ths, 2 Greyhounds, of course the 2 for Freedom, and then 2 Pontoon Bridges, which, again, I'm a little surprised that we're seeing so many Pontoon Bridges mixed in here, but I personally did not like this card, but we'll see, maybe I'm proven wrong. And then, of course, we have the 3 L4 Grasshopper, which is going to be one of the key Sherman synergy cards. 2 Hellcats for triggers on the mechanized, 3 M10s for triggers, and then we have the Sherman package, which is going to be 4 Calliops, 3 Shermans, 2 M4A1s, which is just a very solid card. On the off chance that someone brought this card, this is going to be very useful. But also just can't be targeted by enemy orders is a very scary text to put on a card for particularly control decks. And then we have 3 60-second armored infantry to buff the M4s. I am genuinely shocked that this deck doesn't run the M4A2, because I think this is better than the M4A1, unless you're seeing a lot of discard. I think M4A2 with the reduction from 6 to 5 cost is a solid card, a very solid card, and a way to generate value with the Sherman deck that sometimes struggled to generate value. Now, I feel like if you're just playing 1 tank at a time, it's going to be a lot easier for your opponent to trade out. That's sort of the benefit of the M4A2, is it made it almost guaranteed that you stuck a Sherman, and then, you know, you can start to do stuff with like 60-second and whatnot. So, with this deck built the way that it is, I just feel like there's a little bit too much card draw and a little bit too little payoff. Like, the Sherman deck oftentimes just has a full hand, but you can't really play your hand. And, you know, you have the Shermans, but, like, there's not a lot of cards to take the front line with the Sherman, especially with the L4 Grasshopper. It's just, like, a very easy card to remove. It's hard to push to the front line. And all around, I'm not a huge fan of this deck. I think it is worse than other ways you can build US. However, I don't think it's terrible. Then let's take a look at his second deck, and this is where we get really spicy. Intradiction has a Soviet USA self-damage deck with the tank synergy. So we've seen the 12th guards, and of course we have the 4 SU-76 and 2 SU-152s. I'm a little shocked that there's the SU-152s rather than the other SUs. The SU-85 or the SU-100, because these, to me, have like very natural synergies with self-damage. The SU-100, you can ping it with a sickle and go face for 8 damage. The SU-85 can heal back some of the health that you lost from damaging yourself. Whereas the SU-152 is, has synergy if you've stuck tanks on the board. But how many tanks is this deck actually running? 11? So it's not nothing, but I feel like it is going to give you less impact on average than the other 2 cards. These feel like they have more synergy in the deck. And I'm saying that actually from experience, because oddly enough, I actually tested a Soviet self-damage tank deck. I don't think I did it with US Ally, which was obviously a very smart thing to do, because you got the Hellcats and the M10s. In retrospect, that was very obvious, so, absolutely full respect for recognizing that this is a very solid deck, and I do think this is a very solid deck. I think self-damage is good. I think the tank synergy package is insane. And this is just a really solid thing to be doing. Also, just to stand together with 34th guards, absolutely insane. And then, of course, the T-35's very good synergy with the entire deck as a whole. However, I do think that this could have been built slightly better for my own liking. However, all around, very solid deck. I'm excited to see that deck in action. Then we have a Jagro deck, and this deck is on the 4 expansion, so already it's better than Spoker's. And we have the 458th Infantry, which I previously said I don't think you need 458th Infantry. I don't think 458th Infantry makes the deck bad. I think this is very, very solid. The 1 Yokosuka is a little surprising. I do think I would value Yokosuka over 58th just for the 0 op to get to the frontline expansion. If you're on the back foot, particularly against all the tank decks running around, it's often a big way to have a huge tempo turn. If you could do like Type 93 Cavalry Regiment Yokosuka, you hit something for 4, and then you take the front line with like a 3 attack cavalry. And that's 3 credits to do so. So I value Yokosuka definitely more highly than that. And then we have the 2 Suppression, which is becoming a bit of a staple in Jagro. And then to facilitate that, we have the Seiun, the 1 Zerstore, the Dragon Slayer, obviously the Audacity, with the new and returning air units in the Key 30 and the 2 Aichis. And then we have Shinano and 2 Panzer Grenadiers, and we have on the Ascent. So all in all, I really like this deck. I think this deck is a lot better than Spoker. This deck is closer to what I would bring. Just some interesting things to note, I suppose, about this deck. Is it good? Is it bad? Who's really to say? Only 1 commit the reserves, no Sendai. So it is a little light on the removal. I suppose you could argue on the Ascent is a form of removal. Now, if you've watched my videos long enough, you probably know I hate on the Ascent in Jagro. I just think it's not that I think it is terrible. It's not that I think it's like inherently wrong to run it in Jagro. I just hate playing it in Jagro because I think it does not work nearly as often as people seem to think it works, because people remember the times it works really, really well. Now, with air back in the meta, with a lot of these tank decks running the same attack units, especially with 4 attacks running around, I don't think it's a terrible meta call. In fact, I think I put on the Ascent in my Jagro list that I showed off in the previous video. So again, I'm not saying that it's bad for Intradiction to be running on the Ascent. I just personally hate this card, and I hope it doesn't come back, to bite him, this decision. The most interesting thing to me is the Shinano, because Shinano was started to be run again, right at the closing end of the covert operations meta. I was running it in the World Championship qualifiers, as was a few other players. I think it was in OCC as well. And the meta reason to run Shinano was Jagro was getting really, really popular, so both players would have a lot of units on the board, and a lot of the units would have 1 health. And Shinano, because of that, was really good, because if your opponent had 5 or 6 1-health units on board, you'd play a full support line of units, and then you'd play a 10 damage Shinano that would clear their board virtually guaranteed, and then you'd push forward with all of your units. And it was an insane tempo card. But then it wasn't that really good against any other deck, because any other deck either doesn't have a lot of units, or has high health units, or has not a lot of high health units. So it was really specifically used for Jagro. So with Shenano showing up in this deck, I don't know if Intradiction, just tested it and really liked how it felt against, like, particularly maybe the tank decks. I don't know if he just sort of missed the fact that it was primarily to target Jagro. Maybe he thinks there's going to be a lot of Jagro. I don't know, but I'm just sort of raising a question mark next to that. And then we have the fourth deck, which is, of course, going to be Britain, Japan, Air, 4 cast, 4 duty bound, the 3 1-drops, 3 air sup. I'm only actually running 2 air sup in my list, just because I'm a little worried about total order count. We have a Sonya in here, which I think is excellent with, of course, the Pan from Monty and the Albacore, as well as just being another 1-cost bomber to potentially duty bound on turn 2. Only 3 sea embargo, I think that's perfectly reasonable. And then on the draw end, 4 convoy, Sincerely Yours, actually fitting in a research in here. And then even a little bit more top end than most decks. Obviously the Spitfire, but also the Dragon Slayer, Sexton, Wave After Wave, and even an Empire of the Sun for just extra card draw. I don't actually hate this. I think this is an interesting way to build the deck. Obviously, not running the Recons or the Type 94s, so it's playing it a little bit slower. However, the benefit of playing it a little bit slower is you are much more likely to get full use out of your duty bands. The one worry I would have is just, like, is your opponent going to blow you off the board more consistently early in the game and then kill you before you get the chance to play some of these heavier units, because you have slightly less consistent early game. But all around, I think this is a very, even though it's different than the way I build my air deck, I think this is a excellent deck. I think this is easily the best of Intradiction's 4 decks. And Intradiction's 4 deck lineup, to me, it's really the Sherman deck that just sort of stands out as, I think, a little bit on the weaker side, but it's likely to find some decent matchups. But honestly, of the 3 lineups we have seen so far, I think Intradiction is by far my favorite, and is closer to what I expected everybody to be kind of doing. I'm a little shocked at what we saw in the last one, but not too shocked because one of those players was TreePipit. Now let's look at what WinnerWillWin has brought. And the first deck up here is a Germany-Finland-Heinz deck. So, of course, T26, only 2 of them is a little shocking, but 3 Panzer IICs and 3 Panzer 1Bs. So he's all in on that, like, very aggro, veteran synergy Heinz stuff with fast Heinz. Of course, 3 Lotus Fired and a 62 infantry. I love 62 infantry. I don't think we're going to see a lot of it in this tournament, but I absolutely love this card. I think it's excellent. Of course, WillWillWin calling out some of the air decks of the meta. Dornier, very solid option. 1 Reichsbank. The 1 Reichsbank is very interesting, but if you look at the order count of this deck, it's 31 units, so I don't hate the single Reichsbank. And obviously, he's caught Blitz Doctrine. He's not, like, confused on how the card works. It is just going to be 1 Reichsbank to just play down a whole bunch of tanks. And you don't, like, have to Enigma on the Reichsbank turn. You can Reichsbank, empty your entire hand except for Enigma, and then play, like, Enigma on the following turn. And then 3 copies of the Sturmy, and I'm very excited for this because I haven't seen anyone play this card. I haven't tested with this card personally yet, but I think that this card is kind of just an insane thing. And then 1 Blitzkrieg, 2 Panzer F, 3 33rd Panzer Grenadiers, White Death, 2 Panzer 3J Lates. Very excellent deck. The one worry I have is it's a little low on card draw. And when you're running stuff like Panzer 1B, Panzer 1C, that are like a multi-card combination that you want in the early game, if it's like turn 7 and you draw like a Panzer 2C, you do a 1-3 tank that can't even attack. That's really, really bad. So this deck definitely could fall off a cliff at a certain point, but it is also capable of getting very aggressive openings and punishing some of this, like the quote-unquote slower Soviet tank decks where, like, you're not really doing anything, and then you play a big tank on turn 3, and then on turn 4 you, like, attack something with that big tank. If this deck is killing you on turn 4, then, that's too bad. So, very solid deck here. Then we have Britain, Japan, Air. Again, not that surprising. This is a different way to build it. This version is much more aggressive, so this version actually does not run Duty Bound, and instead is running Defeat in Detail, which is a little bit of a win more card, but it can snowball so quickly. Type 93s to bump up the attack of those air units very early on, and again, push on the damage. Then we have 2 Sharks and 2 Albacores, so leading a bit further into that early game. 4 Sea Embargo, 1 Burning Sun. So Burning Sun's a card you don't see very often, but it can put out a ton of damage. Even an Otsu, which is a absolutely wild choice, but Otsu I've always thought is like a very scary card if you could get it to work, and honestly, it's just a very aggro Brit Air deck. I think you can get this to work. So all in all, it's not the way I build my air deck. Obviously, it's not the way Intradiction built his air deck. I think Intradiction's air deck is more consistent, but this deck is definitely more than capable of taking wins by just having a much stronger start and just snowballing like you wouldn't believe with Defeat in Detail. However, you know, this deck is going to be harder to come back from behind because of these sort of win more cards like Defeat in Detail. Then we have his third deck, which is Finland Ally again. It is a USA Finland frontline aggro type of deck. Maybe a little bit more mid-rangey. So we have the Scout cards, the 164ths, 2 Bocage Warfares, 2 T26, and actually 2 Air Core Farian. So this is the first time we've seen this card. This card was a very, very hyped, but I didn't end up really seeing like anyone play this card. I tried testing it like a little bit, but it was just kind of awkward to use because you had to play the buff towards the start of your turn before you spent your credits on playing more units. And as it turns out, your opponent just wouldn't leave you with many units on the board. Then if we look at the more of the deck, of course, the For Freedoms, the Lotus Fards, 1 Calliope, which is interesting. And then we get to some weirder stuff once we get to towards the top end of the deck. Because at the top end of the deck, we have 4 Order of the Day, which is the add 2 Sissy to the support line, and your Sissy it costs the enemy 1 more to target this. And we obviously have the 4 Sherman, the 1 White Death, we could do it reasonable, Strap Bombing reasonable. And then we have both copies of the Infantry Regiment 56, which says add a Sissy to your support line to give your Sissy units +3/+3. So, just some wild Sissy synergy coming out of left field. It's difficult for me to say how I think this is going to go, because I've literally never seen anybody run these cards before. I have to say, I'm a little skeptical. I think I would have preferred just seeing the Sturmy that he actually ran in the last deck, the German Heinz deck. I'm a little surprised he just didn't run this, and then, you know, it works with Bocage Warfare, works with Lotus Fard, and it sort of fits into just the aggressive theme of the deck. I feel like Order of the Day and Infantry 56 are just a little out there, and don't quite have synergy with the very aggressive way that he's built the early part of his deck. So yeah, it seemed a little incongruent to me, so definitely some question marks there. And then his fourth deck is a Japan-Finland deck. So obviously, WinnerWillWin, huge fan of Finland, bringing 3 Finnish decks. When honestly I thought we'd see like maybe 1 Finnish deck across the entire tournament. WinnerWillWin bringing 3, and this one is Jagro. With, yeah, like, as you can see, it's not really, it's not like a full-on mid-range, almost control salvage type deck. We have just the regular Jagro stuff, with a smokescreen sub-theme. Maybe sub-theme is, like, even, like, yeah, I think sub-theme is probably the correct word to use. So we have the, Ju Shokasha, the Type 92, 1-drop with smokescreen. And then of course we have an outmaneuver, so that's already just can be an insane start if you start with a Type 92 and do outmaneuver, but it's only 1 outmaneuver, so it's a little weird. Again, Defeat in Detail, very win more, but I think it works better in Jagro than in Air. And then, of course, just the staples right now, the bombers, the 3K bombers with Audacity, Key 30, and Aichi. A single model 11. For, again, a little bit of smokescreen synergy, 1 detached battalion, which this card is absolutely cracked. I don't know why people don't play this card more. I guess it's because it's Finnish. But this card's, like, absolutely cracked. It's sort of like Pack 40 on steroids, but also has smokescreens for a little bit more smokescreen synergy there, and then even Sendai technically has smokescreen. And the Aichis have smokescreen, obviously. So all around, I like this better than the US deck. I think it's capable of having a very, very aggressive start. Aichi is just like an absolutely crazy card. And if you can buff it in any way, you're off to the races. As you can see, there's no salvage theme in this deck, so there's no Alchemists. and Out the Mist would be like the main card to sort of turn around this deck's win rate into, say, Intradiction's Jagro. So with that being said, will I really like all of WinnerWillWin's decks? I feel like Intradiction just has closer to what I think is like the standard lineup for this tournament. So I think I will have to, in the end, continue to give this one to WinnerWillWin. Or sorry, to Intradiction. I gave this to Intradiction 3-2 last time, and looking at the decks, I think I will give it to him 3-2 again. TreePipit versus Spoker. I said Spoker 3-2. That one actually went down. But now we'll get to one that's very interesting, Stanislav versus Dandelion. I definitely got some feedback from people being shocked that I rated Stanislav so low. So let's take a look at the decks and see if that will stand true again. Alrighty, so Stanislav's first deck here is a Japan-Germany aggro deck. And once again, we see a single copy of Anfreda rather than two. But for expansion, and there's some differences in there, like a single Take Liberty, Noser Store, and still 2 Suppression, so it's a little shocking to see Noser Store, but the IGs are certainly coming in to help, as well as 2 Nates for additional air units on that. Only 2 58s, which I like. There's 1 of Arado. It's just an all-around very solid Jagro deck, single Out of the Mist. There's a lot of one-ofs, but it's kind of difficult to comment on one-ofs, but this is just a solid Jagro list. It is Jagro. It's going to come down a lot more to how it is piloted rather than in any of these like single card differences. I think this is a perfectly reasonable deck that somebody could do very well with in this tournament. Then we have a USA-Britain ramp deck. So, you know, we're going in the same direction as Spoker. And as we'll see, he also has a Britain-USA ramp deck, so sort of really liking that ramp from the previous meta. And this is interesting, because I don't know to what extent this is just bringing decks that were good in the previous meta to not, you know, to just be like, these were good before, they'll be good now, I'll, like, add in a couple cards here or there. Or to what extent this is just like, these are my comfort decks. Or to what extent that he believes that these are still just very, very strong in the current meta. We'll have to see, I suppose, but this deck, very well built. You know, it's dodging a lot of the traps that a lot of bad ramp decks fall into, of just completely ignoring the early game. We have supply priorities, United We Stand, War Machines, and then First Responders, Deathless Brigades on 4, as long as P40 on 4. I really like the P40. I think this card's great. Firebomb as well. And then we have the Glamour Boys, War Bonds, Cameroonians, P51B, and 4 Convoy. And again, the 4 Convoy, very, very key, because a lot of ramp decks, that's sort of the 2 pitfalls ramp decks fall into, is one is just ignoring the early game and saying, I'm a ramp deck, I'm gonna just throw in big stuff. And then the other thing they fall into is, they're like, I have early game and I have big stuff, and then they just don't put in card draw, and then, like, they're, like, top deck and War Machines by, like, turn 8. So yeah, all around, very solid deck. It's obviously there's some differences from Spoker with the Cameroonians, and I don't think Spoker was running the Marauders anymore. Definitely not running the Devil's Brigade, but all around, just very, very solid ramp deck. You know, you see a deck with these types of cards, the Bomber Mafias, the Production Orders. This is enough top end, and then Glamour Boys are going to help guard up, get a bit of healing in there. Very, very solid deck. US research as well. Is just gonna like make this deck win anything that goes a little bit later, unless your opponent has a lot of healing. So that very solid deck. Not a lot else to say about this. Then we get to my favorite deck in his lineup, and my favorite deck, honestly, that we've seen so far, with an asterisk there. It is a Soviet Italy control deck. Now, if you watched my previous video, which was the best decks of Blood and Iron, I said that I think one of the best decks right now is actually Soviet control, but specifically Soviet Britain control. And I think I called out in that video that there was a lot of people playing Soviet Italy control. I think it's good, but I don't think it's as good. And this is still the case. I don't think this deck is as good as Soviet Britain, but it is Soviet control. And that's something we haven't seen before, and just on its own, it's still more than capable of taking games. So, of course, you have the early game elites of Zhukov, Engineers, 97th Rifles. And then he has something that a lot of Italy allied decks do, recently, and something that I really, really like, which is the Fiat G50 and Claim the Skies. And this is just one of the strongest things you could do on turn 2 and 3, because most decks can't answer a turn 2 Fiat G50, and then on turn 3 you can Claim the Skies, and then attack to remove 2 units and heal 6, and most of the time your Fiat G50 will still stick around and at least like eat a piece of removal from their hand or something like that. Very, very incredible things to be doing on turns 1, 2, and 3 as Soviets, because Soviets oftentimes don't really have much to do on turns 2 or 3. And then you're curving into sort of the new Soviet Guards, the 204th, very, very solid card. And then, of course, you get the Italy stuff, the 7th LPDs, you get the Machis, which help end out games and have, again, synergy with those Claim the Skies. And then you have the Soviet top-end elite package, of course, in Naval Brigade T-34-85, Strategic Focus, Front Formation, 4th Guards, of course, is the new one. Both of these two are the new one, the 2 new 9-cost cards, and 2 Detrimas in there for good measure. And this, I feel like, is a little bit too much top-end. Like, if you just have this, that's perfectly fine. And if you have this and you add 7th LPDs, it's like, okay, you're getting a little heavy there and maybe kind of Detrima. But if you get this and then you also add the Machi, you're making shortages in your deck. And if you look at the 4-cost cards in the deck, there's 1 attack in the colonies by the sword, which it's not a 4-cost card, and then the 204th guides, which is good, but it can be removed. So this deck is faltering around turn 4 and 5, and then it's coming back on turn 6. But is that enough to stay alive? Like, you know, I feel like if you miss the Fiat, like if you missed Fiat Claim the Skies, you're kind of struggling. And then the elephant in the room that I haven't really addressed yet is the 3 12th Guards Mechanized and the 3 Su-76. So obviously Soviets are lacking draw at the moment. We see By the Sword in here as like one of the last draw cards left. And this is a way to draw cards. However, with 3 12th Guard Mechanized, how many tanks with 4 or more attack are in the deck? And the answer is 4. There's 3 SUs, and there's a T-34-85. Because it only triggers off of deploying a tank, so Front Formation will not trigger it, which is very important. And I suppose you could Heroes of the Soviet Union into like a second T-34-85, or like a Joseph Stalin or something. But like realistically, it's going to be so difficult to get draws off of this. You're going to have to save it, but it also means you're going to have to save the SU if you don't hit these both in your early opening hand, which means if you miss Fiat on 2, and you miss 12th Guards on 1, and you have SU on 3, it's going to be difficult to play SU on 3, because if you play it, yes, you played a card and your opponent has to answer it, but you are then like making it even less likely you'll be able to hit your draw engine. But like you also don't really need a draw engine with your deck this heavy, so like I feel like this was just like something went wrong in the deck building stage here. I think there is elements of a very, very good deck, but I feel like the curve got sacrificed for an attempt to put in additional card draw with the new cards. And I don't think that really fits. And I think that the deck is significantly worse for it. So it's definitely capable of taking wins if you just like hit the curve, but you're just not going to hit the curve as often as you might otherwise be able to. And then last but not least is the aforementioned Britain main USA ally ramp deck. You see a lot of the same cards as in Spoker's list, and a lot of the same cards as in his Stanislav's previous US Britain list. Obviously just swapped nations. Still on the 2 Cromwell. And that is with Desert Dust, so that will have synergy with Suppressing, as well as Desert Dust is just a 3-cost card that summons 2 guards, which is going to be good against some of the aggro decks. And we see Stanislav really likes the United We Stand. We'll have to see how it turns out. I think United We Stand is a very good meta call, though, specifically for the 12th Guards Mechanized. Everyone's played with 12th Guards Mechanized on turn 1, and if you can answer it with a United We Stand on turn 1, I think that's going to be pretty good. And if they don't play it on turn 1, it might be that they have it in hand, but they specifically aren't playing it on turn 1 to avoid your United We Stand. So all around, very solid deck. Now we get over to Dandelion's decks, and Dandelion's decks are exactly what I expected everybody to be bringing, with one notable difference when it comes to his Britain deck. So his first deck is a German-Soviet tank deck. So as you can see, very similar to the Soviet tank decks that the German-Soviet tank decks that we've all seen, I'm sure, on ladder. So, you know, at the top end, you have the Panzer III J-Lates, you have the 110 Panzer Grenadiers, you have the 20th Panzer Grenadiers. Some odd choices in my mind with 3 Su-152s and only 3 Su-76s and no Su-100s, and also no copies of the 269th, the veteran unit that reduces their op cost by 1. I feel like that's very good. No Panzer 3Es, despite having, obviously, some of the Blitz tanks. Also no Panzer 2As, despite having, you know, Greif and the Blitzkriegs. So just not the way I would build the deck by any means. I feel like there's just some elements in here that don't make a ton of sense, like the Felder Hull, this card. The Pack 40, I feel like is just a little odd in there. I feel like this deck is a little bit too heavy for Enigma, especially when you're running Panzer 3Hs, which again, feel like you'd rather just run something else. So all in all, I don't like the direction this deck was built in. However, I think regardless, it is still just a very solid deck. It's hides with card draw coming out the wazoo. It's going to be a fine deck. And we get to his Britain deck, and it's Britain-France, which is kind of shocking. It's not shocking that someone would bring Britain-France. I think Britain-France is a reasonable deck to bring. It's shocking that it fits into this lineup, and it's not Air. Maybe he was worried that people were going to hard target Air. Maybe he just felt that this deck was excellent. But of course, it is ramp, and with the French slots, you are running the cards you sort of expect with 4 Compromise, 4 Honor and Loyalty, 2 Phony War, and 2 Defend in Depth for a little bit more removal. And then the British cards are sort of the cards you'd expect. 4 First Responders as just early game, or not just early game, but as a way to answer your opponent. And this is actually very effective because your opponent is trying to dump their hand as quickly as possible, so they dump their hand on board, and then you get like a 6/10 5th Brigade. Honey, which is going to synergize when you're playing stuff like Compromise and Phony War to draw a lot of cards. And then Creeping Barrage, Wrath Lightning, and Churchill Offray and the Black Prince, all forms of retreat, which are just going to either destroy the cards outright if their hand is full, or make it easier to then mill cards off the top of their deck. And then, of course, Co-Belligerence, this is going to add to your fatigue counter. Carpet Bombing, it's just a board clear. Wave after wave, it's just a board clear. Glamour Boys, it's defensive tools. Like, that's basically the entire deck, is you try to mill and overdraw all of their things that give them value, all of their big units, all of their scary cards, all of their combo pieces, and then you try to clear everything that they play on the board with AoEs, and then, like, you know, sit up with Glamour Boys, and then eventually win on fatigue. It's a very solid deck. We've seen it before. It definitely got some new pieces with Monty and Creeping Barrage. And yeah, I've played against this deck a fair amount on ladder, and it's a good deck. I'm just worried that I'm worried about the matchup into the Soviet ally tank decks, because I look at this deck and I say, well, what's the answer to a turn 3 SU? And it's like, well, there's Honor and Loyalty or there's Defend in Depth. And it's like, okay, but on turn 3, you're probably not overdrawing them with Honor and Loyalty, so you play SU on turn 3, you Honor and Loyalty it on turn 3, and then they play like a SU on turn 4. Or they play like a Panzer 3J late on turn 4. I just feel like the tank deck has enough of these mid-range tanks that are slightly out of Carpet Bomb range, that are slightly out of getting traded out by a Glamour Boys range, but that there's enough of them that you simply can't rely on like your limited French removal cards to take them all out. And I feel like if the decks are well built enough that the tank decks are going to be able to handle the mill quite easily. Then we move on to Dandelion's third deck, which is Soviet-German tank decks. So this one, fairly similar to stuff we have seen before, with, again, a few exceptions, like the 2 copies of 321st Rifles Regiment. This card's very spicy. I've tested this out in German ally aggro decks, like, I don't know, 2 years ago, just as it's a 1-drop infantry to trigger 35 Ts, and it sticks around as a infantry on the board. Also, it sticks around on the board as just things you can throw into the front line for more Blitzkrieg potential. Does this deck need it, with already having the Engineers, the Rifles, and the 12 cards? I'm not sure. I don't think I would put this card in my deck, but then again, I'm not in the top 16, so who's to say? Then we have this, Hammer and the BM, which again are just kind of odd choices for this deck. This deck is supposed to be an aggro deck. It's running Blitzkrieg. It's running 35 Ts. You know, it's a very aggro-oriented deck, so why is it running stuff like Hammer and BM? The Hammer I can kind of get because it can like take out a Glamour Boys and be like a bit of a tempo card. The BM is just very odd to me. It doesn't have synergy with the rest of the deck at all. We see the 1-up Suppression fitting in here again, as well as a Dive Bombing. I think these are reasonable choices. The Suppression actually has an air unit in the Yak 7 for a little bit extra card draw. And then we would look towards the top end of the deck. Again, the Pack 40, I feel like it's out of place. Again, the German 3K44, I think it's out of place. Again, 3 copies of the SU-152. this one I think it makes a little bit more sense. I feel like you don't really run that many tanks in this deck, to be completely honest. Like beyond like 35 Ts, everything else is a tank used to trigger. And again, there's no 269th. And then on the top end of the deck, you have Corson, which I think is fine, KV, which I think is fine, and then 4th Guards Rifles, which I think is fairly questionable. But, you know, it's going to work sometimes, and that's good enough. So again, very similar to the German-Soviet deck in that it's absolutely not the way I would build the deck, and I think the way it is built is going to lower its win rates across the board. However, its win rates across the board are already really, really high. So I don't think... I'm going to say this now, I don't think Dandelion's winning World Championship with this lineup, but I definitely think he is capable of making some progress into the bracket with it. And then last but not least, we have a USA-Soviet tank deck. So this is kind of what I expected was the Soviet-Germany, Germany-Soviet, USA-Soviet, and Brit-Air instead of Brit-France at the end as being like sort of like the meta list in my mind, or maybe throw in Jagro instead of one of the tank decks in there. And this deck does have 269th rifles, so we finally got that. No SU, no 3-cost SUs. Again, we have the SU 152. This one makes the most sense out of all of them because there is the most just other tanks in the game. I'd still just rather have the 3-cost tank, I think, just to make it easier time getting it out of my hand, triggering the veteran effects on these cards. But again, I think in this case it is the most reasonable. Obviously, we just have the regular frontline stuff. We have War Machines, which is odd to me, because the curve of this deck is not that high. However, there is the card to draw to make up for it, which is usually the reason you don't run War Machines in tempo decks. It's less that War Machine itself is really, really bad, it's more that it's just like you don't run the card to draw to not worry about drawing War Machines past turn 2. And this deck is fine with that, it's just, I'm not convinced that, you know, there's not better things you could be doing on turn 2 rather than playing War Machine. In this case, like, there's no 35 Ts because you don't have the German ally, there's no 20 seconds and whatnot. So, I kind of get War Machine. I think War Machine's an interesting choice here. I definitely don't think it's as bad as some of the choices in his other decks. And then, you know, you just have the frontline top end of, like, Sherman's, Hellcats, M10s. All of these are going to trigger. Strategic Bombing, of course. 2 weakened duets is a little interesting, but with War Machines it makes sense. So, all around, I think this is probably his best built tank deck of his 3. And that is the lineup. So, on Stanislav's side, we have 2 ramp decks, a control deck, and aggro, and then on Dandelion's side, we have 3 aggro decks and mill. So obviously the mill is going to be very, very powerful against the ramp decks and the Soviet control. The Soviet control is just going to be entirely, does Stanislav draw front formation? Because if you play front formation on turn 9, the mill deck is just done. It's going to be also probably pretty good against Jagro, just with all of the first responders. So I would expect the mill deck to eat a ban, most likely, and then it's just 3 tank decks versus Stanislav's decks. And there, I could see Stanislav taking it. I had originally had Dandelion 3-1, and a big part of that was I did think Stanislav might choke. And that obviously still can happen. I can't say that he's going to play excellently based on his deck lists. However, I think that it's at the very minimum going to be closer. I think just decks to decks, I think these tank decks are not fast enough to consistently get under the ramp decks, and I think the control decks are definitely capable of sort of going up against it. And then the Jagro deck, I think, is more than capable of going under it because these decks do not run. The Soviets one's going to be a little bit harder because of all the sickles, but it can definitely go under the German deck at the very least. Jagro actually might be the hardest deck to get through from Stanislav, so I think that's going to be sort of where he falters in getting across with the Jagro list. Even if he's playing it well, I think it is just unfortunate matchups. And I'm going to have Dandelion taking that one 3-2 over Stanislav. So now let's look at the decks of the last matchup in the top half of the bracket, Xyloser versus Guest. Alright, so the Guest's first deck here is actually going to be somewhat similar to the Stanislav's, actually. It is going to be a Soviet Italy control deck, although slightly differently, this one does not have the 12th Guards Mechanized and SUs as the drop package. However, this one does run 321st Rifles Regiment, which is the same that we saw in the Soviet-German deck that Dandelion had. why people are playing this card, I literally could not tell you. I can't think of a single reason why this card is suddenly good in the meta. Yeah, that's the end of that sentence. I have no idea why people are running this card. Of course, it has the Fiat Claim the Skies package as well, which is one of the main reasons to run Soviet Ally. It is to, or the Italy Ally with the Soviet main, is to make the deck more playable into air. Now, if we continue looking down this deck, he actually is building it a bit more aggressively. It's still like a control deck, but it's a control deck that's trying to end the game, rather than doing the typical Soviet thing of just eventually your opponent runs out of cards and you kill them with like a single unit. And to help accomplish that, there is 3 copies of the 392nd, which is the unit that damages units you play to give them +2 attack, and then once it does 4 damage, it veterans, and it has a passive, your damaged units have +2 attack. And that's going to have amazing synergy with the SU-100 as just a burst 10 for 10 credits. 10 credits, burst 10 from hand, not bad. As well as the Machi, which is going to be a 12 credits, burst 7 from hand. And obviously these things combine, so with the Machis and the SU-100s, and if one of these 390 seconds can stick around on the board, this game is going to be able to be ended very quickly, and you have stuff, of course, like the KV, which is going to help you get there a little bit faster, and that's on top of controlling the early game with stuff like Sickles. And you see that there is a lack of the 7th Alpini guards in this deck, because it is a bit more aggressive. It's not relying on like large guards and huge health gain, which then comes to the question of why is it running front formation. This could just be a tech card specifically for Mill, because obviously Mill can heal outside of the range of all of your other stuff, whereas if you have front formation, it's you just play it and it wins. So it could just be specifically for Mill and maybe like certain ramp matchups. But it does feel like it doesn't really fit the rest of the deck. The rest of the deck is trying to end the game quickly, and then front formation is just like a card that you want as your win condition in a deck with lots of healing, whereas this deck doesn't have that much healing. And yeah, I think the curve is fine, so I think it's not making the deck substantially worse, but it is a bit of an oddity. Then we have a USA-France deck, and we get our first Throp deck. And is it the Tempo Throp that I like? It most certainly isn't, because if you look at the top end, it is Big Throp. So you have the big red one, you have Persian, you have Super Fortress, and to help cheat that out, you have Mayhem. Yeah, this deck is absolutely wild. This deck doesn't even run War Machine, which is kind of insane that you're not really running War Machine in this deck, like you had said, running War Bonds. But it is Throp. It does have a Milk Truck, so there is some additional ramp in there. I don't like this deck, to be completely honest. I don't think this deck is particularly good. In fact, I will go further than that. I think that this deck is particularly bad. I think this might be the worst deck we have seen so far. And in this format, where your opponent gets a ban and then you have to win with all of your other decks, having a really bad deck is really, really bad. Like, your lineup is as bad as your worst deck. So if your worst deck is awful, it can't win a game, you can't win a series. And this deck can win games. That might have to be like, you know, turn 3 Milk Truck, turn 4 Mayhem on a Milk Truck to pull out a Persian. And like, you know, there's a decent amount of decks that will just immediately lose on the spot to that. Or like pull out a Super Fortress and then you play Pontoon Bridge on it the next turn and kill them in 2 turns. There's definitely ways that this deck can win, but they all revolve around using Mayhem to cheat out something hilariously big very early on, which is like a 3-card combination that your opponent can play around. Otherwise, I just don't really see this deck having it. There's not enough stuff to answer early game aggression. There's not enough synergy cards for the Throp themselves. There's a lot of orders in there, and there's none of the cheap Throp cards, which means you're really playing 1 unit a turn, so you can't get maximum value out of stuff like Les Terribles or like the Moroccans. Yeah, I guess like maybe you play against a control deck and they have a slow start, and then you like hit research into like cheat out a Super Fortress that they can't answer. This cannot beat any deck that can win like before turn 7. This deck is just simply really, really bad. And that's very unfortunate, because the Soviet-Italy deck was interesting, as well as the Japan-German deck. This is just Jagro, 1 Aunt Freda, 4 expansion, you know, good man right there. And yeah, this is very similar to a lot of the other Jago decks we've seen. Obviously, 2 suppression makes sense with the Nate and the Aichi. And this actually might be an exact copy of the deck we saw from Dandelion. I'm not certain. At the very least, it's very similar. And yeah, Jago is Jago. Don't have to say much more about that. And then last but not least, we have another Britain-France mill deck. Or no, Dandelion didn't bring good Jago. Maybe it was the same as Stanislav. Maybe. Somebody had a very similar looking Jago deck. But anyways, Britain mill. This deck is built slightly differently. We see a doubting system in there, and only 3 first responders, so maybe it is looking for sort of more ramp decks, trying to catch a research, being scared of nukes, being scared of front formation. Front formation it has definitely is definitely sort of the main counter to mill at the moment, I feel like, if you can get it off. But otherwise, the deck looks very similar. That might indeed be one of the only changes in the deck. We also see the 2 albacores with the Cromwells for a little bit of suppress opportunity in the deck, and is His Majesty's Chosen. I don't like His Majesty's Chosen, but you know, it is what it is. It's mill. It can beat heavy decks. It can beat aggro decks with just its insane healing potential, but it's not super likely. Then let's move on to Xylucer's decks here. We have a Germany USA mid-range deck on Freda deck. I don't really know what to call it. You see there's a decent amount of 4 attack stuff in here. Like, Zyer has 4 attack, Schütze does 4 attack, Comet does 4 attack. The only, like, 4 attack synergy card is the 110th Panzer Grenadiers, and that's just because this card is absolutely insanely broken. And of course we have the Panzer Grenadiers, and we could do it, Pack 40, Panzer 3H, Panzer 3J. Just like the good German stuff that costs more than 4. Or more than 3. And then we see the good German stuff that costs 1 with Nakshub, Suppression, Narados on Freda, Jaeger Regiment. And then you see the stuff in the middle, and there's not a lot of it. You have 35 Ts and WinnerWillWin's 22nd Infantry, and then the only 3 drops is the Calliope. And yeah, if you take a look at this curve, a lot of 1 drops, but, you know, a decent amount of those are orders. And then it sort of goes straight down into 4, and there's no war machines in this deck, so I'm a little concerned by the curve of this deck. I think this deck could very easily just be raffle stomped by one of the tank decks, by just simply having a better curve, just more consistently being able to play out more units before turn 4, rather than play out one thing at a time. However, against a control deck, or if this deck just hits a good curve, this deck is more than capable of winning. Aunt Freda in particular is a very good card in this deck. Obviously, lots of infantry, lots of tanks. And while not a lot of fighters, Comet in Aunt Freda is really good as just like a way to, as just like a burst potential. You just keep the fighter buffs in your hand until you draw Comet, and then, you know, you just hit him in the face for 9 or 7 or whatever. So yeah, all around, very solid deck. It's a little weird. I will say it doesn't have any like crazy synergy. It's just simply a bunch of good cards in a deck, but a bunch of good cards in a deck is sometimes enough. Then we have a Germany USA deck, and this deck is slightly differently. This deck definitely has a bit more calculated synergy in here with the 164ths. So not with the 164ths, but it has more calculated synergy. End of sentence. It has the 164ths, the 35 Ts, PIR, just like regular frontline stuff, of course. But then, interestingly enough, there is actually no Shermans. There is 60 seconds to give you Shermans. In theory, more likely it is going to be used to buff the Calliopes, but, you know, you could get Sherman off of this, but no Shermans. And we have Pontoon Bridge, and, you know, this can be used on a number of different things, like the Panzer 3J. It can be used on Zerstore to reset its op cost. But what I really want to draw attention to is these 10th Engineers battalions. We saw 1 in the German-US deck, now there's 2 here, and they're almost certainly for synergy with the Calliope, so he is going to be able to buff up their attack to 4. And of course, the We Can Do It can just make these things, like, unkillable 2/7 monsters. But again, no War Machine, and if you look at the curve of this deck, very high. So there's more things to do on 3 now, because you have the Pathfinders, you have the M10s. A little less to do on 2, because you don't run the WinnerWillWins anymore. But all around, it's just a good stuff deck, and I feel like it is... There's sort of like a... There's a hump where if this deck can, like, get out like to turn 3 or 4 without like completely losing board control. In a situation where like anything they play will get traded immediately in the best possible way. If it can like get to turn 4 on an equal board state, this deck is like gonna be really, really good. I think that's similar to the German deck. The one place I could see this deck falter is on card draw because of the lack of those Shermans. However, there's just enough big stuff that against most tempo decks, you'll be able to keep up with them without that. Against control, I think this deck is going to falter just on lack of card draw. Being a very big issue. Only 2 Jaegers, no 20 seconds, no Shermans. So, yeah, some things can help you get across that with the Panzer Grenadier, just with value generation, and the P-51B. However, yeah, there's definitely some question marks around this deck, but it's just a really solid deck. Then we have Xylucer's take on Soviet Italy control. So actually a lot more Soviet Italy control than I was expecting. This one, a little bit of some 4 attack synergy with the 49th, as well as 3 copies of the 190th, which is a card that I actually haven't seen. But it is a good enabler for the 49th. Of course, you can also kill 4 units, and it can become veteran, and if it becomes veteran, it's very, very good. And then we move on to the top end of the deck, and there's a lot of one-ofs in here, and also a lot of seemingly attempted targeting of air. Now, there's only 2 Fiats and only 2 Claim the Skies, but of course there is the Yak 9s on top of the Machis. So this feels like a deck that is supposed to be a little bit better into air, perhaps, than, you know, other Soviet control decks. But again, there's a ban, so there's a reason why Soviet control, if you're going to ban air, is a very good option, without anti-air cards. But, you know, the fighters could also be really good against the Jaguar decks that run the Aichi and whatnot. Stand Together is also an interesting one-of card in here. There's a few things you can stand together on. There's now a 8-cost infantry for Italy, the Trento division, so you can stand together your Decima into a Trento division. That is absolutely not how that card works. I'm thinking upgrade. Stand Together, of course, is transform it into a Soviet tank of the same cost. So you can turn the Decimas into KV2s, is how that card works. Just a little bit of a brain fight right there. But all around, you know, it's on the heavier side. This deck does not run front formation. So it's not going to have that consistency in the late game. However, it does have a bunch more mid-range threats than some of the other decks ran. So yeah, this is a very solid deck. I'll leave it at that. A very solid deck, not how I would build Soviet control, but with 2 By the Swords, it should have a decent chunk of card draw, and then there's definitely some threatening units in this deck to be scared of. And then last but not least, we have Britain, France, Mill. So we're seemingly going to get a lot of Mill. This one a little bit more anti-aggro than the other ones we've seen, with Desert Rats and Albacores and Honeys in the deck here. And then on the top end, we don't see the Wellington, but we do see Carpet Bomb, which I believe one of the decks didn't run Carpet Bomb. So yeah, it's a more anti-aggro deck, so by doing this, you're going to be dropping win rates against stuff like Ramp, but you're going to be increasing win rates against stuff like tanks. However, I feel like, again, this deck is good because it beats control, and it's still not gonna be great into tanks, even with some of this anti-aggro package. So I do question to some extent if you're maybe you know, taking away from the decks it's supposed to beat to try to make it less bad into certain decks. I feel like you should just accept, like, you want to get it into certain matchups. But it's neither here nor there. How do these lineups match into each other? Obviously, they both have Mill, and they both have Soviet Italy. I think it's a little tough to tell. I think it really just comes down to this US deck being absolute garbage. Like, if this US deck was, like, literally anything else, if it was any other deck we have seen today that could legally be in this lineup, I think I might give it to Guest 3-2. But you have to factor in, 1, Xylucer just has much more experience than Guest, and 2, Guest just has an absolutely awful deck. So, if we bring this back up in full screen, I will be giving this to Xylucer. I'm going to say 3-2. I think Guest is going to be capable of winning every single game except for that US deck. Now, I don't know if he's going to, like, just hard ride the US deck, or if he's going to leave that for last, just because it is his weakest deck. And I don't, but I'm going to have Zyer taking that one 3-2. And that is going to be the end of this half of the bracket. Now, let's get down to the second half of the bracket to take a look at what our other players have for us, starting with TreePipit versus HQT. Alrighty, so starting with HQT's deck, we have Jagro, and this is once again going to be a double Aunt Freda Jagro. And, this deck has the Restorers, the Dragon Slayers, one Winter Regiment is an interesting choice in here. And then, of course, just the regular 3-cost Japanese planes with the interesting inclusion of Seiun. And yeah, it's possible we've seen this exact list before. It's possible that we've never seen this exact list before. All of the Jagro decks at this point are just sort of melding together. They're all like within like 2 cards of each other, basically. The one main thing here is the 3 expansion, so that makes this most similar to Spoker's list. And my thoughts on 3 expansion? I think this deck is absolute trash. Yeah, this is. Actually, this might be an exact copy of Spoker's Jagro list, because there's also 1/22nd in here. So yeah, definitely lacking in on the card draw department. I don't like this deck, so we will move on to his second deck, which is a Soviet Germany tank deck. And this one is quite similar to, I believe this one is quite similar to Dandelions, and that's not surprising because HQT, as far as I'm aware, is in the same like practice group, friend group as Spoker and Dandelion, so he has one deck from each of them, so this is basically a deck I've reviewed already, but it is a deck that I still don't really like. It's Soviet Germany, it has Blitzkriegs, it has the tanks, it has the mechanized, so it's going to have like a baseline strength. I just don't think it is built in a particularly good way. I feel like it is not putting on the pressure as quickly as possible, which is what this deck should be trying to do with its crazy draw engine. And just also the types of decks that we've seen in the meta, there's definitely some decks that are going to punish tempo decks that play a little bit too slow. Speaking of decks that punish tempo decks that play a little bit too slow, we have the US Britain ramp. And this deck is very similar to the Spoker's US Britain ramp. It actually might be just the same deck. The more I look at it, I think this is actually just the same deck as Spoker. So we see HQT definitely coming from inside that group. Maybe copying decks from other players, just based on the fact that Dandelion and Spoker themselves don't have any overlap between themselves, whereas HQT is taking decks from both of them, so perhaps maybe a situation where HQT doesn't feel as strong as a deck builder, so is just taking the decks and practicing them from other players. Nothing wrong with that, absolutely. Not trying to throw shade. But this ramp deck, I think, is really, really good. I think it's much better than the previous 2 decks we've looked at. And then this Britain USA deck is, again, I think, just a copy of Spoker's Britain USA deck. So again, very, very solid ramp deck. Yeah, I don't really have much to say about these 4 decks, because it's 4 decks we have already seen. So let's take a look at TreePipit's decks, because these are decks we've definitely not seen. The first one being here is a German USA Heinz deck. And German USA Heinz, like, seeing Heinz in this tournament is not that surprising. Heinz is very, very powerful, but it's all with Soviet ally using the mechanized. So TreePipit, again, I think I called this out in my last video, is he's going to bring meta, but he's going to bring slightly off meta. Like, he's going to bring meta in a way that you didn't expect. And this is certainly it. Someone saying if you said someone's bringing Heinz, absolutely expected, that's meta. If it's US ally Heinz, what are you doing? The reason Heinz is so good right now is because of the Soviet cards. Well, what does TreePipit have for us? Well, he has, of course, just the normal stuff. You have the For Freedoms. You have some of the newer stuff, like the 62nd Infantry. I really, really like this card. And it's going to be quite good in this deck because you don't have the 269th for more AoE op cost reduction. So any op cost reduction you can get is going to be good. And then that's basically it in terms of new stuff. Otherwise, it's just like regular old Heinz. You have the 164th, you have the Panzer A's, you have the Blitzkriegs for lethal. I'd say like the most interesting thing is 2 Vicious Salvos, probably just to tear off guard off of units. The issue with Vicious Salvo is it doesn't suppress the thing you target, so if your opponent only has 1 unit on the board or only 1 unit on one side of the HQ, it's actually very easy to play around Vicious Salvo as a suppress card. But to make up for that, there's also 2 M10s. And then on the top end, you have a Panzergren, a We Can Do It, and 2 Panzer H's to help you find Enigma, and 2 Blitz Doctrines to help generate value. I don't like this deck, because I just feel like this deck isn't taking advantage of any of the unfair things you can do from the new expansion. Like, if this deck existed in the last expansion, particularly before Blitz Doctrine was nerfed, I'd say it's really good. This deck actually looks fairly similar. Like, we saw Head, qualifying to the OCC with a German USA Heinz deck that didn't run Bank, or anything like that. It was just simply a Heinz deck that ran aggressive cards like this. And that was really good, but I feel like there's just better things you can be doing. And not to say that this deck is bad at all, I just feel like there's better things he's missing out on. Then we have a USA Japan deck, which Teaa actually made it through qualifiers with a USA Japan ramp deck. This time it's USA Japan, but it's more of an aggressive deck. So we can see the 164ths, the Type 94s, the Duty Bounds. So we're getting Duty Bound in an aggro deck that's not air, so that's going to be very interesting. And then 2 Grasshoppers for some Sherman synergy. Again, really likes this Vicious Salvo. And then we have the 4 Calliops, which are Shermans, of course, for the L4s, 3 M4 Shermans, and 3 62nd Armored Infantry to buff the aforementioned Shermans. But again, shockingly to me, quite shockingly to me, no M4A2s. I can't even find it. Here we go. No M4A2s. This is quite shocking to me. This deck makes slightly more sense because it's much more aggressive. The Duty Bounds here seem a little off-place to me because it's not like this deck runs a ton of card draw. And I do question the value of Duty Bound on just like Sherman tanks, because making big tanks bigger is generally a lot worse than making small fighters or small bombers bigger. But, of course, it's Japan Ally, so there's 2 Aichis, so you do have some stuff to buff. But, again, I feel like this is just sort of like the classic Teaa deck, where it's like, you're doing close to meta things, you're just doing it in ways people don't expect, but in ways that are maybe slightly worse. I said in the video that I thought he would be playing meta with a slight edge. I'm not seeing that edge so far, just looking at his decks. It just feels meta slightly worse. However, I will say the rest of the field, there's a lot of not meta going around. There's a lot of weird stuff. Then we have Tekaa's Jagro deck, so Japan-Germany is ending up to being a very popular deck. And in terms of stuff we have seen from other people, of course, you have the Aichis, the Dragon Slayers, the 2 Suppression with Seiyun, WinnerWillWin for coming back into Jagro for a good matchup against Air. And then the stuff we aren't seeing from other people, we have a single copy of Blitz Doctrine and a single copy of Defeat in Detail. So going in 2 different directions, Defeat in Detail, very much a win more card, whereas Blitz Doctrine is very much a value generation card. So interesting to see these 2 very different directions being taken in a Jagro deck. But again, individual cards in a Jagro deck, it's sort of difficult to say how much of an impact they will make. Obviously, the Blitz Doctrine can turn games around against control decks by just generating a bunch of value. But it's also possible that, you play Jagro into Jagro, and then you get stuck with a Blitz Doctrine in your hand, which you would never have the credits to play, because your opponent is putting you just under a ton of pressure. So, all around, it's Jagro. It's not wildly different than what other people are doing. And last but not least, we have a Soviet USA self-damage tank deck. I'm not sure if Teaa worked with Intradiction on this one, but obviously the decks are very much similar. And maybe they queued into each other on ladder, but they do share some Discord servers, so I wouldn't be that surprised to learn that they did work together on this one. And some notable differences is this deck is slightly less in on the tanks. Only 3 SUs, only 2 T-35s, no SU 100s. So actually just a fewer tanks overall, in exchange for, is it for the Hellcats and the M10s? I think maybe putting in more US tanks than Intradiction had. I'm trying to remember sort of the differences between these 2 decks, but all around, I think this is a very pleasant off-meta deck that can definitely take some scalps. I think this is probably the best of Tekaa's 3 off-meta decks, not counting the Jagro deck. So how do I think Tekaa's decks match up into HQTs? I think I'd have to give HQT a slight edge. I think the 2 ramp decks are going to be more than capable, if played properly, to dominate Tekaa's lineup here. I don't think I'd give it, to me, I think I'd give the lineup a slight edge in favor of, I think I'd give the lineup a slight favor in edge of HQT. The difference is Teaa built his own deck lists, and there's such a big deal where you build your own deck list. It means that you have practiced these decks in and out. HQT, it looks like he has copied these deck lists from other players, so to what extent is he going to be comfortable on them? I'm not sure. Either way, I think it's going to be close, but just to make things slightly different, I will say HQT 3-2 over Teaa. Just because, honestly, when I made that initial prediction, I did think Teaa would have better decks than he has. In terms of, like, I thought the differences would be more clearly in a way that is targeting the meta, or it just feels like his decks are slightly worse than meta decks. However, I definitely have more confidence in his play than HQT, but I think maybe just the deck advantage will give HQT the edge there. So next up, we have Henry versus Princess, and that one's going to be quite an interesting one for decks. Alright, so starting with Princess, we have a Japan-Italy deck, and this is quite interesting. This is sort of similar to decks we've seen in the past. I feel like it's honestly most comparable to perhaps TreePipit's Japan-Germany air deck, in that it's like a aggressive mid-range deck, or it's a control deck with a win condition. So you have that control package, and part of that might not be able to see because a Japan main control package is often very similar to an aggro package, but you have 4 Alchemists, Recons. This is going to help you against Jaguar. There's one expansion, which, if you're going to run one expansion in any deck, this is the deck to do it in. I feel like you could probably fit in a second one, but one's fair. Then you have some Fiat G50s, of course. Interestingly, not running any air superiorities, despite running a lot of air units. Perhaps that could have been better. But what's really interesting here is the 4 duty bands. And that's obviously going to be a big help on something like a Fiat G50 or an Aichi. And then if you start looking up the deck, you've got Attack of the Colonies, Takasagi, Take Liberty for a little bit more card draw, Winter Regiment can be a beast, Dragon Slayer, and then if you look at the top end of the deck, you have 2 Machi as just burst potential. Those with duty bands can be a lot of damage. Decima, a single one, just a little bit of removal. Empire of the Sun, a little bit more removal and a hand refill to help fish out those last duty bands. And to the last man is a board clear. So it's a very different deck, and honestly, I wasn't really expecting this from Princess. I know Princess sometimes likes to cook. I was not expecting Princess to cook that hard in Worlds. And this deck is definitely cooking. It's a little hard to evaluate how good this deck is right now. Like, I see certain things. I can see the vision. I can see how it works. I'm just concerned about how consistently that is going to work, because it feels like at a certain point, like, how are you getting from Winter Regiments to Decima, Empire of the Sun, like, Machi Attack? Like, I feel like there's a huge jump from, like, turn 4 to turn 8 in the lineup, and I'm not convinced that you are going to easily be able to make that jump against some of the crazy synergy stuff that's going to be going on in the meta. It's possible with certain draws, and it's also possible that your opponent will be scared to push stuff up into the front line because of stuff like Winter Regiment or the 58th Infantry. Just farming you, maybe you can get a lot of value out of the mist. I'm just very worried that this deck is simply just going to get rolled over by the tank decks. That's just going to play down a bunch of tanks that all have 0 up, and then you can trade out like one of them with a Winter Regiment, and then they push up 2 more in Blitzkrieg and kill you on turn 5. So, not the best deck we've seen here, certainly. I think it can definitely struggle against certain aspects of the meta, but it is not a stinker of a deck by any means. Then we have Britain, Japan, Air, of course, 4 Cass, 4 Duty Bound, going with 3 Sea Embargo in exchange for 1 defeat in detail, so a little bit more on the win more side, but we do have the Type 94s. 3 Air Sup, 1 Albacore, 2 Shark, so very solid air deck. This one is fairly close to mine. I think it's probably the closest to my list out of all of them we've seen. And I'm not saying that to be like, oh, he somehow copied my list. I just am saying that, obviously, I built my list in the way that I think the deck is best built, and maybe I'm correct, maybe I'm not correct, but it is worth noting that this one is probably the closest to the way I built it. Obviously, some things I don't really like. I'm not a fan of the defeat in detail. I feel like this is a little bit too win more for my taste, because if you have buffed up planes that hit the HQ twice, you win the game anyways. And you care more about burst potential than long-term growing a big board. But that's neither here nor there. This deck it's Brit Air. It's absolutely capable of taking wins. It's a very scary deck. Then we have a deck that is once again cooking. It is a Germany USA sort of like mid-range deck, but it's not at all like the way Zyer built his. So first of all, we have the 432nd. I love this card. This card is just excellent. It raffle stomps Jagro. It sticks around. It can like 2-for-1 easily, but it's also an enabler for 35 Ts, which Germany can often lack. So you feel very comfortable slamming that guy down on turn 1. Obviously, he falls off quite a lot later in the game because it's a 1/4 vanilla unit, but I don't think this is just immediately makes the deck bad, to be clear. 3 Aunt Freda, 2 Suppression, so definitely leaning heavily in on the Aunt Fredas here. And then we have the 4 Calliope, similarly to Xyluser, thinking the Calliope is absolutely crazy, and the similar top end to Xyluser, with the Schutzens, the Zerstors, and the Comets, and the Zerstors and the Comets being the only fighters for Aunt Freda, which does kind of raise some questions in running 3 Aunt Fredas, especially since you're already running Blitz Doctrine, which is going to be giving you some value generation. So this deck definitely has a lot of value generation. I'm just concerned that this deck is going to get absolutely brutalized from the tempo of decks like Air and Soviet ally tank decks. I'm just not convinced that this deck is going to be able to compete with the tempo. The 2 Schutzens are going to help a lot. I kind of wish there were more Schutzens in this deck almost. But yeah, I am greatly worried about this deck. Also, it's just some weird stuff like 1 KFC and 1 Greyhound while there's an open US slot. Just some bizarre things going on in this German-US deck. And last but not least, we have Soviet Italy. So Soviet Italy turning out to be way more popular than I expected. So like the other decks, it's on the Claim the Skies Fiat G50. Unlike the other decks, it is running the Petliakov. It's running like a 1/476th or 456th. So it's actually like a bit of a self-damage combo. And then similarly to I forget who it is now off the top of my head, but similarly to the previous player that we saw bringing the 3/12 guards, or was it Stanislav that brought it? But we saw a player with 3/12 guards, and yeah, I think it was Stanislav, and 3 SUs. So that is being continued here with 3 SUs and the 1 T-3485 being the main triggers. There is 2 additional triggers with the SU-100s that Stanislav was not running, so it's slightly more consistent. It is still not nearly as consistent as I would want it to be, but you do have some interesting synergies like the Petliakov stopping the deployment effect of damaging you on the SUs. And then if you look at the top end, of course, there's going to be the Machi that these players seem to absolutely love the Machi, and obviously it has great synergy. It can close out games. It's a big fighter, it has blitz, it can trade stuff out, and it can work with Claim the Skies to get through a big guard and then hit face. And then on the top end, we do have front formation, strategic focus, single Decima, 4th guys rifles, no naval superiority, which we've seen some players on, so it is cutting the curve slightly lower, and that is something that I am perfectly fine with, but is running a lot of that potential burst, not running the veteran guy that pings, though. But I think that's fine. I feel like that might have been leaning a little too hard into the potential synergies of the deck. This is an all-around very solid way to build Germany-Italy, or Soviet-Italy, sorry. I'm just still not convinced at all by these 12 guards with only 6 tanks. But that is Princess's lineup, or Ozzy's lineup, however you want to call him. Now let's take a look at Henry. And Henry is a player who has made a name for himself on the France decks, on the mill decks. And I said, I don't know if Henry is going to try to bring anti-meta, or if he's going to bring meta. And I said, I think if he brings anti-meta, he loses 3-0 or 3-1. And if he brings meta, he loses 3-2. So let's take a look at what Henry brought. And the first deck is Japan, France, Mill. So, bring an anti-meta, bring in Mill, however you want to label it. But let's give it the decks a fair shout. So, looking in, we have a single forced surrender. Already, that's a bit of an odd choice to me. I feel like forced surrender gets better the more pin you run. So it makes sense to run 2 of them if you're going to run any of them. 3 Optimist, very good against a deck like Jagro. 4 Tora Tora, which with Mill, you're going to be able to be emptying out your hand really quickly, so you don't need Tora as exclusively an anti-Jagro card, because you can stack them. Same with Out of the Mist. I do feel like maybe leaning a little too hard into the low health unit counters, because I just am worried about, like air the Soviet tank decks. There's going to be a lot of 4 health units, and like, you're going to need a lot of Toras and Out of the Mists to deal with 4 health units. That's not easy. On the Ascent's good. Obviously, you just have like a bunch of the good Japanese elites. Then you have 4 Honor and Loyalty, 4 Compromise. Using Exhaust All Options, very great choice of a card, which again makes me wonder why maybe if a second Forced Surrender wasn't a good choice to throw in the deck. But Exhaust All Options works really, really well. Where, if your opponent has like 3 units in the support line, you play Exhaust All Options, they can only play 1 unit because it will get pinned, so they can't like blitz it up, which means it's hard to get rid of cards in their hand, and then you force build them on the following turn. Of course, 4 stacks of 388, the new Blitz 6/4 that draws the enemy a card, so this can act as removal and forced draw. 2 Phony Wars, Osaka Regiment as a bit of guard, and then the 2 elite board clears, and 2 Sirens to help with those Out the Mists and Tauras. You're going to need to cover a lot of ground to get up to the credits necessary to do these types of combos. I have tried to build these types of decks a lot in the past. They can definitely beat decks. My issue with Japan in particular is Japan can run enough removal and AoE to take out all of your opponent's units, or Japan can draw your opponent through their entire deck. It's very difficult to do both of them because Japan finds a hard time of getting units that are going to be able to do anything more than 1-for-1, so it oftentimes turns into your opponent just simply outvaluing you faster than you can outdraw them, because you're just going to be drawing them and they're just going to be hand dumping over and over and over, and as Japan it's much harder to answer hand dumping over and over and over than, say, Britain. So it's a good deck, but definitely weaker than the British France mill decks I think that we've seen. Then in a very different direction we have a Germany USA, it's like a mid-range deck, I think would be the best way to describe it. It's technically a 4-attack deck. So starting off, we have 3 Buzz Bomb, which is interesting. Not going to say it's good or bad, it's just interesting. It's also interesting that we haven't really seen it before until now. But this is just a way of saying, like, I want my deck to be smaller, I want it to be more consistent, so I'm just going to simply run a card that lets me draw a different card in my deck so I can more consistently hit the cards I want to hit. Jaeger for Freedom, also similarly cycling. Suppression is going to be cycling if there are air units. Arado is an air unit, and it's also going to cycle. So this deck is running a crazy amount of card draw, with 2 Aunt Fredas, 4 War Machines. So this is running the War Machines that we're missing from the other 2 German US decks that we've seen. And then on the top end, we have the 304th Panzer Grenadiers, which I suppose synergizes with the Buzz Bombs, as just coming out as a 5/5 Blitz Infantry. And this, if it does come out that way, it is going to be very good at answering some of the stuff from, for example, the tank decks. And then on the top end, we have the Tuzer Storage Comet for the fighter package with Aunt Freda, as well as with Suppression. And then obviously you do have the Arados and the Dornier to get there as well. And this is an interesting deck where you're running so much card draw, and there's no clear, like, big thing you're going for. You're just simply going to hit some Blitz Doctrines, get value out of your tanks. You're going to hit Comet and burn your opponent down. You're going to hit your Aunt Fredas. It's basically just, like, trying to just get out your high value cards as many as possible over and over and over as quickly as possible. And you know what? I think that's probably good. I kind of like the way this deck looks more so. I think it passes the eye test much more so than what we've seen from the other 2 German US decks, the one from Xylucer, and I forgot the other one off the top of my head. But to me, I think I like the way this looks. It looks slightly more reactive. It has much more consistent draw. The big question, though, is going to be, is it just going to get bricked out of the opener? Because there is sort of a stage between being able to easily answer opponent's big stuff and being able to pop off with your stuff. There's a world where it could just get blown out by like 269th and playing down a bunch of stuff. Then we have a Soviet France mill deck. So this is just running all of the Soviet anti-aggro tools, 845th, mobile defenses, even a snowstorm being thrown in there. Interestingly, only one sickle. That's because sickle draws you a card, and you are trying to win on fatigue. So that's sort of the eternal paradox of Soviet France control is Soviet's best card is Bloody Sickle, but you don't want to run it. And then, of course, you just have like the mill package, the 2 Defend in Depths, the 2 Phony Voice, which seems to be the pretty staple 12-card package for a French mill deck. And then we have the Soviet top end with Front Formation, Winter Warfare, or Winter Offensive with the board clears Depth of Winter strategic focus with just basically all of the elites. And then you have a few guards in there. Interestingly, the 654th is a very fun one to get value out of, and then Upgrade. I really like Upgrade Siberian Transfer. I think it's quite powerful right now in the game. And like, I feel like if this deck just wasn't a mill deck, it would be a lot better, you know? Like, I feel like if this was just Soviet France control, and you took out the compromises and the honor and loyalties for just, like, some Call to the Colonies, and maybe a Reba, I feel like this deck would just be better. I feel like Henry is maybe getting lost in the idea of mill. Maybe there's some specific decks he's trying to target. Obviously, we saw a lot of ramp decks, which personally wasn't something I was expecting, but mill can be very powerful against ramp. So maybe this was just a meta call, and it's going to work out really well for him. Unfortunately, there's just also a lot of Jaguar, there's a lot of air, and I feel like this is not that great against either of those two things. And last but not least, of course, if we saw the Japan-France mill and the Soviet-France mill, we were expecting to see the Britain-France mill. Not particularly different from some of the stuff we've seen 2 Wrath Lightnings for just like a little bit more retreat stuff. Not running the Creeping Barrage, maybe missing out on that tech. Having played against this deck a few times, I think the Creeping Barrage works out really, really well. But obviously it's a new thing, so that's an immediately scream mill when you look at it. So perhaps maybe missing that, not being in the same practice groups, or maybe seeing it and just not liking it as much as running the other cards. But you know, this is the best out of the 3 France ally decks. So if he was against one of the players who brought double ramp, I think I would lean it to HQT, but if we go back, I think with the Front Formation, as long as Front Formation doesn't get milled, I'd give this to Soviets against any of the mill decks. I think I'd give this against any of the mill decks. It has Comet, and it's going to be able to hand dump reasonably fast. Air deck is just absolutely dominant against mill, and like this is probably like the weakest deck against mill. But like, can mill really beat this 3 times in a row? I don't think so. I feel like the IGs are going to cause too many issues. I feel like the mill is going to help you get to duty band really quickly and potentially just close out the game by your opponent not being able to answer a ridiculously buffed up card. Yeah, I unfortunately for Henry, I do feel like perhaps these decks could have worked out. I will give him that. There's more decks that are good. Mill is good into than I was expecting in the tournament. However, they're just not the ones that his opponents are playing, unfortunately. So I will be giving this 2 Princess, 3-2 maybe. I imagine the Brit France mill deck is going to get banned, and I do think the German-US deck is capable of getting a win, but I think I'm going to go for 3-1 on this one. And then let's take a look at Killswitch versus Kalin, our 2 Euros. Not the only 2 Euros, obviously. We do have Stanislav at the top of the bracket, but 2 Euros going up against each other, so let's take a look at their decks. Alright, so Kalin's first deck here is going to be an air deck, but it's actually going to be Britain-Germany air. So Germany being used for Force Suppression, 2 Errado, and 2 Crossfire. And, you know, air is air. It definitely runs all of the very solid air cards you expect. The Gladiators, the Swordfish, the Cass, the Sea Embargo, the Sharks, HMS Illustrious Wellington, the Convoys for card draw, etc., etc., etc. It's a very powerful core cards to air. On top of that, he's running 3 number 9 commandos, so this deck is just going to be able to dominate the board very early on, very consistently, and get rid of like any, you know, buffs. That with the 4 suppressions, also going to be able to help cycle through the deck more consistently. The one thing Germany doesn't offer, though, is any help at closing out the game. You know, you don't get the buffs from like Patriotic Firestorm or Claim the Skies. You don't get the buffs from Duty Bound. You really just get nothing. You get more ways to control the board, and if air can control the board, they're going to win. So this might be potentially better into something like, say, the tank decks, where they don't have any huge AoEs, but I think this is going to make it substantially worse into control decks, where if they simply remove your board once, you're going to find it very difficult to end out the game, because it does lack that extra damage output that other ally nations can offer. But all around, I think this is very solid. With air, I feel like air is going to be able to get the best use out of Crossfire, just with like the bombers and the various pings from Shark and stuff. It's going to be very easy to set up Crossfire to full clear the opponent's board, especially if you set up for it a turn with like Monty. So I do think Crossfire is a bit of a questionable call in some of the decks we've seen today. This one, I think this is probably the deck that it is best suited in. Now let's take a look at Kalen's second deck, which is a Germany-USA deck. And honestly, this looks like the German-USA decks from the previous expansion, just with Reichsbank removed. So instead of Reichsbank, there's 4 War Machine, 2 30-second engineers, or 3 30-second engineers, the milk trucks, to try to get a bit of ramp. And then on the top end, like we saw in Noen's German deck, we see the Alpenfestung and the Leopold. And then, of course, just the German classics, Combat, Panzer Grenadiers, Bomber Mafia with the US ally coming in strong, in combination with Crossfire, so we're going to have extra AoE, which is going to make it really good against Jagro. But again, I'm not a huge fan of Crossfire in general. Or I guess it's only one Crossfire, so not the end of the world. And then Blitz Doctrine for the value generation. The one issue I have with this deck, though, is this deck was very good in a meta where nobody was coming for you. Like, there was Jagro. Jagro was sort of like the one aggro deck. But, like, you know, Frontline played really slow, but everyone was just kind of doing, like, these slow ramp control decks where, like, nothing really happened in the first, like, 5 turns of the game. That is not the case in the meta anymore. Like, from turn 4 onward, you're just going to be getting thrown massive tanks at you over and over and over, and that's if they're not playing Jagro or Air, in which case they're going to be slamming crazy stuff at you from, like, turn 1 or 2. And I'm just not convinced that this deck has what it takes to withstand that. Like, this deck was very good in a very different meta. Now, obviously, there's some things you can do, like you can War Machine into Pack 40, and that's going to be really annoying, or you can War Machine into Schützen, and that's going to be really annoying. But, like, what happens when they play, like, an SU? Like, you can Tactical Strike it, but you go card for card, credit for credit, and then they play, like, a second SU. And then what are you doing? Like, you play a Panzer 3H, and then the SU hits you in the face for 5, and they play down, like, another tank. And then, like, maybe you hipper one of them, and they replay it and hit you in the face with the other tank, and now you're at 10 health, and you haven't really accomplished anything. Yeah, I'm just a little worried about that this deck maybe has not transitioned well into the next meta. But then we have Jagro, and this is just a very standard Jagro deck, not substantially different from what we've seen. This might be the first Schützen we've seen. There's a lot of Panzer Grenadiers, a lot of Winter Regiments. I don't think we've seen any other Schützens, but again, just a solid card to play in at turn 4, or at 4 credits, and then we have an Enigma. And similarly to Intradiction, Kalen's still running Shadano. I don't know if this is a meta call, or if this is just sort of not realizing, perhaps what card, why the card was being run in the deck. The one interesting thing I would say here is the 2 sudden strikes, and we saw those sudden strikes in the German-US deck as well. So perhaps try to target air, or just being cognizant of air, with a lot of these buffed up 1 or 2 cost things that can be very difficult to dominate the board against more of these ground-focused decks like Jagro and the German-US. And last but not least, we have the USA-German Frontline. And this is a very bizarre build of Frontline. So we have 3 Greyhounds, 3 M20 Scout Cars, and 3 164th, so doing a 3-3-3 split across the 1-drops. Not standard. I think standard would be 4 164ths, and then however many tanks that you want. With only 1 Jaeger Regiment, and I think that one's pretty reasonable because of the nerf. And then we have only 2 35Ts, 2 20 seconds. So we have double 20 second, but only 2 35Ts. Double supply shipment, which gets even more interesting as to why you're running double supply shipment with only 2 35Ts. And then if we look at the top end of the deck as to like where are these German slots going, we have 2 Schützen, 2 Pack 40, 2 Panzer Grenadiers on top of the 4 M4 Germans, and also being cut to make room for this is only 1 Blitzkrieg. So I do not like this. Frontline is a tempo deck, and a lot of the tempo cards were removed in favor. I mean, okay, the Schützen and Pack 40 are also tempo cards, but I feel like you removed a lot of the cheaper tempo cards for a lot of the more expensive tempo cards in a deck that already has to run expensive non-tempo cards. I mean, okay, I suppose Sherman, there's a way of looking at Sherman as generating tempo because it's drawing you cards with a body, but it's not affecting the board state in terms of, like, it doesn't destroy anything on play, it doesn't have blitz. So, without War Machines, I feel like you just end up with a very weird curve, and then to replace the cards that you took out, putting in 2 supply shipments, I don't really like this. I feel like you're not guaranteed to have the front line. You're not nearly as close to guaranteed to having the front line as you might want to be running 2 supply shipments. It also does not make up for 1 Blitzkrieg. You can't really, like, those don't replace each other. So yeah, I'm not a huge fan of how that deck was built. I also feel like maybe just play Soviet Ally. But, you know, that's just me. And then we get on to Killswitch's decks, and Killswitch's decks I know quite well, because actually, I helped Killswitch, build his decks. So, Killswitch and I go way back, obviously he played in the King's Cup, and, you know, Killswitch asked me, after top 16, hey, can you, like, help, you know, test out some decks? So we exchanged ideas, gave feedback, and whatnot. He's not just simply playing, oh, the 4 decks I made for him. You know, he gave ideas, I tested some of his decks, and gave feedback, he changed some of my decks and gave feedback. So yeah, it was a collaborative effort, but I know his decks quite well inside and out. So first up, we have Britain, Japan, Air, and I think that this is, almost card for card, the Air deck. That I have. The one difference is this is still on enemy contact, whereas I switched to recons. The recons were a somewhat new switch for me, but enemy contact is the idea is it has a bit more effect on the board. It's better from behind, right? Whereas recons are better from ahead. But all around, it is just Air. I've talked about this deck a lot. I think this deck is incredibly strong. No notes. Then we have Soviet-German tanks. And, you know, this is a very, very solid deck. You have on the top end, the course, the T-34-85, and then we have the Panzer 3J late, the Panzer 3E, we have the Su-100, on top of the 4 Su-76, so these are all triggers for the 3 269ths, the 4 12th guards, and of course the 3E is going to buff the attack of itself. It's going to buff the attack of the J late. It's going to attack it's going to buff the attack of the Su-100, and it's going to attack the it's going to buff the attack of the Panzer 35Ts and the WinnerWillWin and the BT-7, all of which will have 0 op because of the 369th. I just think that this is the best way to build Soviet Germany. I commented a lot on how others were building Soviet Germany, and I didn't like it. I didn't think it was aggressive enough. This is how I think the deck should be built. It's putting on the pressure. Almost everything you play has Blitz, and that's just going to enable Blitzkrieg even more. So there's not really those, like, deployment do stuff. Like, there's no like deployment, it's a big body, or deployment, buff the attack of your units on board by 1, or give them heavy armor. Like, or, you know, when you attack with other tanks, heal. Everything in this deck, well, almost everything in this deck, obviously, is going to be able to attack immediately, or at the very least as quickly as possible, and it is most likely that they will have 0 op while they are doing that, and that's just trying to end out the game as quickly as possible, and I think that is going to work out very well for Killswitch in this tournament, because as we've seen, there's definitely a lot of decks which are slower. I was not expecting as much ramp, I was not expecting as much Soviet control, and the faster that this deck is, the better it is going to be against slower decks, as well as also just the more reactive it's going to be against stuff like Air or Jagro. So all around, again, very solid deck. Then we have Germany Soviet, and Germany Soviet might be just the best out of all of the tank decks, just simply because you have Nakshub, you have a Greif on top of the 3 269ths. Again, I talked about, I think, almost card for card this exact deck Maybe one or two differences in my previous videos. I'm not going to talk about it too much more, but basically, same thing as the Soviet deck. You run a lot more stuff with a Blitz than we've seen from a lot of the other players. It's a much more reactive, and it is trying to end the game as quickly as possible with the Blitzkrieg, the Fast Tides, the 110th Panzer Grenadiers. And yeah, it's going to be quite effective at ending the game as quickly as possible. And last but not least, we have USA Soviet frontline tank deck, whatever you want to call it. So again, I spoke about this deck in my video. I didn't play it, but I spoke about it as one of the honorable mentions instead of Throp. And yeah, again, Patton in this deck is absolutely crazy once you get it off with a 269th. And any one of these 4-attack tanks. This deck it's slightly less reactive than the other decks because you don't have Germany, so you are instead forced to run the M10s, the Hellcats, and the Shermans. But you make up for that with more reactive 1-drops, with 4 Greyhounds, 3 Scout Cars, and 4 164s, just going all in on the 1-drops. And Patton as just like the potential to just like almost kill your opponent from hand. Sort of makes up for the lack of Blitzkrieg and the Panzer III's. And the deck just has crazy draw with 4 Shermans and 4 12th Guard mechanized, so that makes up for all of these 1-drops that the deck is running. All around, very 4 solid decks, and, you know, I know that now that it is out that I was working with Killswitch, it's going to seem like me saying Killswitch wins this World Championship, or is my favorite to win the World Championship, is just simply biased, because, you know, I like the man, and I worked with him, so obviously I'm most familiar with his lineup. And that definitely has an influence. I'm not going to claim that that has 0 influence on my bias, but I did not go into that video. I'm genuinely not lying when I say that I did not go into that video saying I'm going to pick Killswitch to win, because he's the guy I'm working with. I just happen to think that I think Killswitch had like a slight edge over every single one of his opponents in the 4 matches that he's going to play if he makes his way to the Grand Finals. And going up against Kalin here, I don't think that is going to be a whole lot different. And in fact, I think Kalin's decks have some pretty solid weaknesses, so I'm going to give that one to Killswitch. A pretty convincing 3-1. Obviously, Kalin has some very good decks. I think that air deck, notably, is definitely going to be quite good into Killswitch, since Killswitch is bringing a much more aggressive lineup, and the Britain-German is going to be better into more aggressive decks and worse into slower decks. So that deck's quite scary, but like all in all, I think Killswitch should take that series quite handedly. And now, let's take a look at our final 8 decks of this top 16. Goru versus Juan. What is Juan bringing? What is Goru bringing? Huge questions going all around. And maybe that is going to change the outcome of that. Because again, Juan was one of those players who I knew nothing about. So it was very difficult to judge, you know, is he going to be able to bring decks that are going to be good enough to go against probably the weird decks that Goru are going to bring? Because let's be honest, Goru's probably going to have weird decks. So let's take a look at those now. Alrighty, so let's start with Goru's deck. And the first one up we have here is actually a very similar deck, potentially the same deck as Zyer Germany USA frontline. I believe it was Zyer. Let me actually double check that right now. And sort of the key things I'm looking at here is the 4-stack of the 4-stack of the Calliops and the single copy of the Engineers regiment coming in from USA. And yes, that was in fact Zyer deck. So this is a very similar or exact copy of Zyer deck. Bringing in that 10th Engineers with the 4 Calliops. And like I said about Zyer deck, that deck is capable of winning. If it gets off to a strong curve, this deck's very capable of winning. However, it does not run War Machine, so I am a little worried of it just getting sort of smoked out at the beginning of the game. I think that's less likely to happen against Jagro, just because 164th is a very good answer to Jagro. Like, Jaeger can answer Jagro, Panzer 35T can potentially offer a very good comeback. Calliops coming down on turn 3, but that's going to be very good against Jagro. I'm not worried about this deck into Jagro. I'm worried about this deck into the tank decks, and I'm worried about this deck into air. And I'm not, you know, we do have the Sky Barons coming in here. I don't think Zyer had that. So there's definitely some consideration for going up against air decks in here. However, is that going to be enough? But we do know that these cards are good. Germany did not lose all of its insane cards. Germany just has some very, very effective units, mid-game units, that this deck is going to be looking to exploit, as well as a 4-stack of the Calliope. We'll see if this turns out to be as good as the swag that came before it. Moving on, we have a Britain-USA ramp deck, and this deck is going to be using 1/4 of those very, very necessary USA slots in a ramp deck on Calliopes. We see 4 War Machine, 3 Calliopes, only 1 production order, 2 War Bonds, 2 Bomber Mafia. Those are the US slots. And that is really showing that Gorky thinks that this is the swag of Blood and Iron. We'll have to see if that is going to work out for him. But all in all, this ramp deck, very, very solid. We do see some interesting choices like the Ultra, which could turn out to be very, very key. And then just, some of the very powerful British elites. Lancaster, Firefly is going to be really good in this tank meta. Black Prince is just an insane card. And, Wrath Lightning is going to be quite good against air. But also it's just going to be good against anything if you can retreat a card and just gain tempo. And that's really what Ramp wants in the mid-game, is tempo to make up for the fact that you didn't do anything in the early game other than gain credits. So all in all, I think this is a very good deck. The one question mark to me is the lack of carpet bombing in this deck. I feel like you maybe will turn out to want slightly more board clears, because how effective is Bomber Mafia going to be against some of these bigger units? It doesn't really do much against air. It doesn't really do much against tanks, because often all of these things have 3, 4, 5 health. So we'll see how well this ends up turning out, but all in all, very solid ramp deck. Then we have a USA Britain ramp deck, which again, 4 Calliopes, 2 62nd Armored Infantry. Gorky really going all in on these Calliopes. And yeah, the rest of the deck is pretty standard. The 2 supply priorities, the Albacore that we're seeing a lot of these ramp players like to put into the deck. 4 Glamour Boys, again, no carpet bombing, but we have the Bomber Mafia, the Strap Bomb, does the AoE, the 1 Wrath Lightning coming in here again. Interesting that he really likes this card. And to me, the standout question mark of this deck is the 1 of Halifax. Seems kind of wild to me, especially considering that if you go back to the Britain deck, there was no Halifax in the Britain deck, which ran more bombers. And maybe it's just like he's like, I can't run Wellington, I can't run Lancaster, I want another thing that it does stuff, so I'm going to throw in a Halifax. We'll see how this works out for him. To me, I'm not sure Halifax is, like the best card you could have run. If you just want a big bomber in the deck, like maybe even just running a raw B-17, running a high altitude bombing. It's not a unit, but it can remove 2 things. That can be quite effective. But obviously, it could turn out to be very good against something like, say, Mill, where it's just putting out damage with a body that's very threatening. And last but not least, we have Japan-Soviet burn combo. I think this is sort of the deck that we expected from Gorky. This is the other decks are like, a little bit odd. This is probably like this deck is like a little bit odd, but it's similar to what other people brought. This is ramp with just notable heavy on the Calliopes. This is sort of ramp notable heavy on the Calliopes, and this is a Gorky deck. Actually, Japan-Soviet is one of Gorky's like most popular or most played like sort of archetypes for him to go in on weird stuff. So what is this deck doing? Well, this deck is self-credit denial. It's got the 3 air, land, and seas. Of course, it's got the Desperate Measures, only 1 commit the reserves, interestingly enough, for a self-credit denial deck. But you got the 40th Cavalries, you got the 1 Roofs, and then for draw, this deck is going to draw itself crazy. We have the 3 Sallies and the Grand Plan, 1 Grand Plan to help discard that Sally, 3 Lesser of 2 Evils to help discard that Sally. We have recons, we have 4 expansions if he's going to be able to get to the front line with some of these units that he's got. And yeah, this deck is just all in on the card draw, all in on the self-credit denial. The self-credit denial acts as removal. And what is the combo that he is looking for? Well, he is looking for burn in the form of, obviously, the Desperate Measures, but in the form of these 4 diplomatic attaches. So combined, these deal 10 damage, and the 4 duty bands, which combined are +10/+10, and those can go on a Type 94 to blitz face. I'm surprised he's only one Type 94, considering he's running 4 expansions and 4 duty bands. Or it can go on the Key 30 An, which, with 4 duty bands on it going face, swings for 14. So obviously, if you have, 4 duty bands and 3 diplomatic attaches, or 3 duty bands and 4 diplomatic attaches and a Key An, if you have these 8 cards in combination, they deal 20 damage to the opponent. You can throw in a Desperate Measures and maybe a Cavalry hit face on turn 2, and you can drop one of those. You only need 7 of those cards, and obviously you can be drawing on your turn, and essentially just the idea of this deck is you reduce the cost of everything in your hand by Cavalry, you stack up on some 1-roofs, and then you pop off and try to just draw all of the cards in your deck in a single turn to kill your opponent. The issue is, if you play like 3 Glamour Boys, or like you play like a Sincerely Yours and a Glamour Boys, and then this deck can't win anymore. This deck has a very limited amount of burn. There's no great Patriotic War effects. Also, if you just like simply have a fighter, there's only 1 commit the reserve. So if like your opponent just like has a Wrath Lightning sitting on board and a Glamour Boys sitting on board next to it, and then your only way of dealing damage with duty bound is with the Type 94 and the Key 30 An, and you can't remove either of them because you played your only commit the reserves earlier in the game, suddenly you're bricked. So what this deck actually reminds me of is a lot like the Japan-Soviet deck we saw in the previous World Championship from Leo, who brought 3 more standard solid decks that are more than capable of getting wins, and then he brought a Japan-Soviet combo deck which literally he could not win on, and he lost all of his games. And I think that this might happen with Gorkyu. I think this deck is probably a bit better than... Well, no, I take that back. I think Tsurugo TK was probably better. I think Leo just made a lot of mistakes on the deck. I think Gorkyu will play this deck better than Leo played Tsurugo TK. I think Tsurugo TK was a better deck than this. I am very skeptical of this deck. Like, yes, you can draw a lot of cards, but just, it's so easy for any number of decks to just sort of blow you out of the game. If 40th Cavalry gets suppressed, it's pretty Jover. This deck just doesn't have a lot of removal, period. You might end up having to toss a bunch of diplomatic attaches into units. Yeah, I'm just very concerned about this deck. Obviously, like Audacity could sit around with Smokescreen and then get buffed up, but there's no like Aichis or anything. Like, this deck is just really, really all in, and what it's all in for is just not that good enough of a payoff to warrant playing this deck, I think. I think this deck is a complete piece of trash. So, is Juan going to be able to beat this deck 3 times in a row? Let's see. So let's take a look at Juan's first deck, and it is going to be a Germany-USA deck. So we're seeing sort of in the bottom bracket a lot more Germany-USA decks. People really liking this. So we get the 3 Calliops, the 4 War Machines, the 2 Blitz Doctrines. Again, this is actually kind of similar to the decks we're seeing from Xylozer from... I suppose it's most similar to the deck brought by Kalin with the War Machines and the Blitz Doctrines, and at the top end you do have the Leopold. And like I said with Kalin, I do worry that this deck is maybe not reactive enough. I think this deck is perhaps slightly more reactive than the way Kalin built his deck, but at the same time, it's going to be capable against slower decks. It is going to be difficult against faster decks, and I feel like the decks that are going to go deeper in this tournament are going to be the faster decks, because I think they're also going to be doing well against the slower decks, and this just sort of like fits in there with them. It just being a not all-around solid deck, but not excellent. Then we have Britain-Japan Air, and this deck, I think, again, not a fan of the 2 Defeat in Detail. I feel like this is getting far too greedy, and especially there's just too many orders. This deck can brick too easily with 4 Close Air Support, 4 Duty Bound, 4 Sea Embargo, 3 Air Superiority, and 2 Defeat in Detail. Yeah, those combined, that's what, 17 orders that require an air unit on board. Well, technically, you can play Air Sup without an air unit. You can play Defeat in Detail on a different unit, if you have any. But, like, functionally, it's 17 orders that require an air unit on board. Which means if you don't have an air unit, you are bricked. If half of your deck can't be played without the other half of the deck, that is very, very concerning. And then on the top end, we just have sort of the expected stuff: Wellington, Spitfire, the Aichis, HMS Illustrious, 2 Shark, 2 Albacore. not running the recons, not running the Type 94s, but is running the full draw package. So, you know, this deck, if this deck has like a 1-drop and a 2-drop, it's going to work out just as well as any other air deck. The issue is it is not going to have a 1-drop or a 2-drop more consistently than other air decks, and it's going to have worse hands as a result. So it's a very good deck, and Air is a deck that it still might need to be banned by Gorky, because Air is just a very, very dominant deck, even if it looks like this. But, like, you know, if it comes down to, like, oh, I have to win with this Air deck, I have one chance to win with this Air deck, it's like already immediately like a 30-35% chance that you're just going to get a brick hand and lose. And that's not a great feeling. Now let's take a look at his third deck. It is going to be a Soviet USA ramp deck with 4 12th mechanized as the key draw. And we have some Winter Warfare, one of. This is going to be very good for, you know, against any type of Jaggro. Mobile Defense, just a very solid card for War Machine. I'm a fan of running the War Machines over, say, like Milk Trucks, just because, particularly with Soviets, not really doing a lot on turn 2, whereas they can do a lot on turn 4, and that is what he's going to be playing with the 204th Guards. The 654th Rifles, I've not really seen anyone play. I've not played it with myself. Not sure how good this is going to be, but if you played it on turn 3, it's going to be better than if you played it on turn 4. 4 SUs, 2 Hellcats. I'm surprised to not see any M10s. But I suppose Hellcats are slightly more reactive. These are going to be triggers for the 12th Guards. And then, of course, there's going to be the T-3485. So that is in total... I completely missed 3 Su-85s. So this is going to give a little bit more healing on top of the Engineers. And it's also going to work out to be 10 triggers for the Mechanized. And with 10 triggers, I think you're chilling then. Also, the Su-85s are going to be working with the mobile defense tanks. It's going to be working with the tanks off of the 654th Rifles. So getting in a bit of healing there. And then on the top end, you have Front Formation. And then, of course, the elite board players of Depth of Winter Strategic Focus. 4th Guards coming in there. Interesting to not see any copies of the Naval Brigade. And very interestingly, not seeing any copies of Bloody Sickle. This will make this deck very good if it gets matched into a mill deck, because you can very easily choose not to draw cards with this deck. It's going to make it very bad into a Jaggro deck, because you're missing Sickles and you're only running the 1 Winter Warfare. Against Jaggro, this is probably going to get rolled. Obviously, the Firebombs can come in there a bit clutch if you can ramp up a bit, but getting to that point, I'm a little scared, and you're also playing Soviet, so you need to ban Air. So against a deck with Jaggro and Air, I'm a little scared, but fortunately for Juan, Gorky is not running that. And then on the top end, Front Formation, just, if you can get Front Formation down on the board on, like, turn 6, like, you're probably just going to win that game, if you're playing against anything reasonably slow. And then last but not least, we have a USA Britain ramp deck from Juan, and this is just a very solid ramp deck. Of course, the War Machines, Jasko, I'm a huge fan of Jasko and ramp. One of supply priorities, First Responders, 3 Calliopes, sort of going down that Gorky train of the Calliope hype train. A lot of reactive cards. Very interestingly in here is one of Matilda. I have not seen anybody actually really play the new Matilda. And then, of course, sort of the Spoker classic way of building USA Britain ramp with the P-51B as sort of the top end draw, and then you're relying on the production orders and the Bomber Mafias to give you the big units to end out the game. And honestly, I think this is a very solid deck. This is just a very good way. He has the convoys, he has the MI5s, he's not going to worry about running out of cards too much. He's going to be able to go after the hand size. Again, maybe like I would have liked to see like maybe like a carpet bombing fit in here if possible, but all around, very, very solid deck. So, with that all being said, Juan, 4 very solid decks. Like this German deck, I probably wouldn't bring it in. This Britain deck, I would edit. And I'd probably also like make edits to the Soviet deck. But all around, very solid lineup. You know, no clear targeting, not just copying what was played in the previous meta. Juan showing that, you know, either they're a qualified deck builder or they are working with a group of people who are familiar with deck building, or we're testing stuff out. So, honestly, this is showing already off to a very good start for Juan. And how does it match up into Gorky's decks? Well, you know, German deck into German deck, I'd give that edge to Gorky just based on experience. Ramp decks into ramp decks, I'd give, again, those edges to Gorky just on experience. But the issue is Gorky has to win with this deck. Gorky has to win with Germany. And Air is just, or it has to win with Japan, and Air is just simply going to crush that. Soviet tokens, or it's Soviet tokens, Soviet control. Depending on the start it gets, like it can just snowball completely out of control with a Su-85 if it can't get answered. Because again, like if you heal 9 and you basically can't lose. Plus there's guards in there to stop a Type 94 attack. And Britain, or the U.S. Britain, you know, you have some healing in there with Glamour Boys. You have guards to stop the Type 94 attack. You have one fighter to stop the bomber attack. You have Jasko, which can help in there a lot. Yeah, I just think, all around, I don't see how Gorky wins with this deck. I think his best chance is against probably Germany, because this German deck runs no healing. However, the German deck does have Suppress, so, you know, he's going to be able to potentially suppress a 40th if this M10 comes in at the right time. It will completely ruin Gorky's day. Also, it can be quite aggressive when it needs to be. However, I do think that this is probably going to be the best deck for Gorky to try to beat, because I don't think Gorky can beat the other decks. So, with that being said, I think I might have to change this. I think I said originally Gorky like 3-1 or 3-0. I think I'm giving this to Juan 3-2. I just simply think that Gorky brought a deck which can't win. Or can't reasonably, it could be reliably win. Obviously that could change, but I just really don't like that deck from Gorky. I think it's incredibly weak. But that leaves us with our top 8, and if you compare this to my previous predictions bracket, we have some similarities. You know, Xylucer still goes in, Dandelion still goes in, Intradiction still goes in, but you have some shakeups. Particularly in the lower bracket. I think the top bracket might be the exact same players with maybe different outcomes. On the lower bracket, actually there's only one, Juan versus Gorky was actually the only difference in decks. And that is honestly quite surprising. But part of it was just like, I know this player is going to bring a weaker deck. Obviously the score switched around. But now let's take a look at these deck lists in in the different matches, and see if it changes as we go deeper and deeper into this tournament. And to try to keep this video within a slightly more reasonable amount of time, and to also help with the editing process to try to get it out before the tournament actually happens, I'm actually just going to sort of speed run through reading the deck lists. If you want to follow along with the deck lists, you are more than welcome to with the link for the decks will be in the description. You can build them. You can also just like sort of open it in a different tab and go back to the video where I'm looking at the deck lists in game if you want. But just to sort of save time, let's go through the deck lists sort of off stream and spend less time on them, because we reviewed on how all the decks work. Now we just need to know how the lineups will match into each other. So our first matchup is Spoker versus Intradiction. Spoker again on Britain USA ramp, USA Britain ramp, Soviet Germany, the sort of weird Soviet Germany, and weird 3 expansion Jagro. And he's going to be going up against Intradiction, who has Britain, Japan, Air, Japan, Germany, aggro with 4 expansion, Soviet, USA, self-damage tanks, and USA, Soviet, Sherman tanks. And with that all being said, like, Spoker's ramp decks seem like they're going to be scary, but one of them can be banned, and then you have bad Jagro and bad Soviet Germany versus better Jagro. Air is probably going to get banned, so then you have, like, better Jagro. The Sherman deck, I think it's really going to come down to, like, does the Sherman deck beat the Soviet German deck? I feel like the Soviet deck is probably the weakest deck in Intradiction's lineup. I think that's going to be definitely the deck that's going to struggle to get through, and I feel like just the Soviet deck is probably going to be slightly better than it, unless Intradiction can snowball out on artillery, but I think I'm going to still give that to Spoker 3-2. On deck list, just, again, this type of matchup, it's really your lineup is as strong as your weakest deck is. So then we have Dandelion versus Xylucer. So let's familiarize ourselves with their lineup. So Xylucer has Britain, France, Mill, Soviet, Italy, control. Again, it's sort of like these tempo control decks. USA, German. It's not really like... It's sort of like USA Germany frontline. It's with the pontoon bridges and the 10th engineers. It's relied heavily on the Calliope. And then the Germany USA mid-range. Again, no war machines. Just simply relying on the big, good German units. And he will be going up against Dandelion, who has a bit more of a conventional lineup with the USA-Soviet frontline tank deck. The Soviet Germany the tank deck, very similar to Spoker's. The Britain-France mill, again, similarly to Zyer, and then the Germany-Soviet tank deck. And honestly, I just think Dandelion's decks are better than Zyer. I think Zyer is just bringing... Obviously, right now, one of the best things you can be doing in the meta is bringing these tank-oriented tempo mid-range decks. And I just think the way Dandelion is doing it is going to be more effective and more consistent than the way Zyer is doing it. Zyer relying more on the US part of it and Calliope. I think Calliope's kind of going to just get farmed. I don't think it's as good as some people seem to think it is. Obviously, it can be very good into Jagro, but, not everybody has Jagro. Not every deck is Jagro. And you're also probably not going to, 3-0 Jagro. It's somewhat difficult to consistently do that. So I'm going to give this one to Dandelion, which I previously had given this to Zyer, but just looking on the decks, I'm going to give it to Dandelion. And I might even go 3-1 on this. I think Dandelion just simply might have the better decks. There's a lot of mirrors, so it's probably going to end up 3-2. So let's change that to 3-2. But I'm still going to have Dandelion going through instead of Zyer. Now we have HQT versus Aussie. I believe I had Aussie going through, if I recall correctly, last time. No, actually, I completely forgot. I had Takao going through all the way into the semifinals, so HQT going over Takao was upset compared to my previous prediction. But now we have HQT versus Aussie, and once again, pulling up the deck lists, we have HQT on a Britain-USA ramp deck, a USA-Britain ramp deck, a Soviet-Germany tank deck, and a Japan-Germany aggro deck. HQT, of course, just copied his favorite decks from Spoker and Dandelion. Copied might not be the fair word. And then Aussie is bringing Aussie's kind of a bizarre lineup with the Soviet Italy deck, with the... Again, just sort of focused in on the tempo cards, less on the control aspect. Then we have the Germany-USA, the very aggressive deck. It's sort of more of a weird, Germany main frontline type of deck. Then we have a Britain-Japan Air. That one's pretty solid. But then we have the Japan-Italy controlled question mark deck. Control Air, Japan-Italy Air Control, whatever you want to call it. That deck, to me, is going to be the big question mark. And HQT is just simply bringing a very standard lineup. How well is he going to play it? I'm not sure. I think I'd give Aussie the edge in terms of play. But decks, I think I'd give the edge to HQT on decks and give it to HQT 3-2 over Princess. And then at the bottom, we have Killswitch versus Juan. So Killswitch, of course, is bringing the USA-Soviet tanks, Soviet-Germany tanks, Germany-Soviet tanks, and Britain-Japan Air. Whereas Juan is bringing USA-Britain ramp, Soviet-USA ramp, Britain-Japan Air, and Germany-USA mid-range. And to me, it's really going to be that Germany-USA mid-range deck that is going to be the weakest. I don't think the Soviet deck is going to be amazing into Killswitch's lineup. I think they're both probably just going to end up banning Air and just play these ground unit decks into each other over and over. And I think I favor Killswitch there. His decks are a bit more aggressive. Juan's decks are a bit more controlling, and I'm not convinced that Juan is going to be able to... His decks are going to be able to compete with that pressure. So I'm going to say 3-1 for Killswitch. Now we have Spoker versus Dandelion. So again, this one is a slight difference. Last time I had Spoker versus Zyer in the semifinals, but again, Spoker with the two ramp decks, the Soviet Germany deck and Jagro, versus Dandelion, who I might have even been they're in the same group, but they might have even practiced together for this tournament. But Dandelion on the more aggressive lineup with the USA-Soviet tanks, the Soviet-Germany tanks, and then Britain-France mill and Germany-Soviet tanks. So 3 aggro tank decks and mill versus 2 ramp decks, Soviet-German, 1 tank deck and Jagro. That mill deck is going to be very unfortunately situated. if you're Spoker. I just think that you might even have to ban Mill, but then you're left with 3 aggro decks versus your 2 ramp decks, Jagro and an aggro deck, like 2 aggro, 2 ramp decks. And obviously, one of those is going to get banned. If you're Spoker, how comfortable are you on the ramp? I think if you're Dandelion, you probably ban one of those ramp decks. But Jagro, I just feel like, isn't going to match up with all of this Soviet ally going around because of the sickles. And there's also a decent amount of 1-3 tanks, 2-3 tanks that are going to be getting value trades very early on. I'm going to give this series to Dandelion and actually have Dandelion advancing to the grand finals over Spoker. And 3-1, 3-2, little hard to say. We'll give Spoker maybe a slight edge on playstyle, so we'll say Dandelion 3-2. Then we have HQT versus Killswitch. Again, Killswitch on the 3 tank decks and air, with HQT on the Britain-USA ramp, USA-Britain ramp, Soviet tanks, and Jagro. Actually, just in retrospect, I think this might be the exact same lineup as Spoker. And similarly to Spoker failing to get through Dandelion with the much more aggressive lineup, I think HQT is going to fail to get through Killswitch with the much more aggressive lineup. And air versus Killswitch having air where Dandelion has a ramp, where Dandelion has mill, I think is going to favor Killswitch even harder. So there's not really going to be that deck to potentially target. Also, I think Spoker is probably just going to play the ramp decks better than HQT is going to play them, so I'm going to have Killswitch advancing 3-1. And then we get to the finals, where it is 3... They both have 3 tank decks, and then Dandelion has Brit France Mill versus Killswitch on Brit Air, Brit Japan Air. And in that situation, I think the Mill deck becomes a liability, because suddenly there's no control decks. There's no ramp decks to be targeted. It's just all tank decks, and the tank decks are going to be fine into Mill. So Dandelion has to ban Air. Killswitch doesn't have to ban Mill. He can ban Dandelion's best tank deck. And I think that is going to give Killswitch a pretty substantial edge, to be completely honest. And I'm going to have Killswitch taking it 3-1 over Dandelion in the finals. And again, I did not go into this saying, oh, I'm going to put Killswitch winning. But actually, if you look at this, I have Killswitch taking it 3-1 over everybody. Last time it was 3-2, 3-2, 3-2, past the first round. But looking at just the decks, to be completely honest, I think that the quality, I was overestimating the quality of the decks from the players, and I was also overestimating how tempo-oriented or like very good anti-aggro control there would be. There's a lot more heavy stuff than I was expecting, a lot of more slower stuff than I was expecting overall, and not in a good way for the people bringing those decks. I think this is Killswitch's tournament. Now, obviously, anything can happen. It's best of fives. Best of fives, like, you know, you could just, like, full mulligan and not get any mechanized. You can, like, hit double blitzkrieg in your opening hand. You can go on air and not find any air units. Anything can happen. Obviously, it's still a 1 in 16 for, like, to correctly predict any one of these players winning. So, you know, if Killswitch doesn't win, it's not like, oh, a massive upset. But to me, Killswitch is now even more of a favorite to win, in my mind, than he was before, just based on the deck lists. But I also think Dandelion has a very good shot, because I think Dandelion has a very solid deck list, and where he's situated in the bracket, I think that Mill doesn't really become a liability until later on in the series, but he's also going to have some more closer fights against some very good players with some solid lineups before he gets to the finals. So I'm less confident on Dandelion making it to the finals than I am to Killswitch making it to the finals. And if Dandelion isn't in the finals and it's against like something like a Spoker, somebody like a Zyer loser, I think maybe that finals match becomes more of a 3-2. But again, that is my prediction. If you made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching. Let me know who you think is going to win now that the deck lists are out. Who do you think has your favorite lineup? What is your favorite deck of the tournament? Is there any specific decks you're very excited to see? Let me know all of that in the comments. And again, to watch this tournament live, it will be tomorrow and Sunday, Saturday and Sunday, December 14th and 15th, live on the Cards Twitch channel starting at 9 a.m. EST. I believe maybe 8 a.m. EST, actually. Correction there. And there will be, on the Saturday, 2 games streamed from the round of 16 and 2 games streamed from the top 8. And then on the Sunday, all 3 games will be streamed from the semifinals and the grand finals, where we will crown our new world champion. I will be on the casting team helping cover this event, so if you don't care about the tournament, but you like to listen to me yap on, then feel free to join there. Anyways, subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming content, and I will catch all of y'all in the next one. Thanks for watching.